Hey guys, welcome to Politically Provoked, an interactive podcast where we host debates, panels, and interviews. I'm your host, Brittany. Todd is here. How are you, Todd? Oh, wait. Hold on. Now you're here.
Yo, what's up? You got me?
There he is. Yeah, we got you. All right, we are having some issues, but we've got them all figured out, I think, so we can get this debate started. We are going to be doing this on Odyssey, DLive, or on Twitter, and Entropy. So let's bring on our guests. They're going to be debating populism and Trump. So first up, let's bring on Rob Noerr. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so if you want to introduce yourself, tell people where you lie on the political spectrum and where people can find you.
Yeah, my name's Rob Noerr. I consider myself a populist conservative. For the context of this debate, I was a Trump supporter, though heavily criticized him. I even volunteered for his campaign and was offered a small job by the Trump team here in Pennsylvania. I normally stream on twitch.tv/Rob Noerr, all one word as it's spelled there, most weeknights around 8 p.m. Eastern to around 10 p.m. or longer. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Next up, let's bring on Richard. How are you?
I'm doing great. My name's Richard Spencer. My digital footprint is a lot smaller right now. I'm kind of focusing on publishing projects, but I will regularly, probably about twice a week, do Twitter Spaces, and those have been quite successful. But yeah, might get back into streaming at some point. But at this point, I just hop on to other people's platforms.
Well, thanks for coming on. All right, so yeah, we are going to be doing populism and Trump. Each person can have an opening statement, can be as little as 1 minute, no longer than 5, about the topic and your stance. After that, we'll open up the floor for open discussion. For those in chat, if you have questions, tag Politically Provoked, who your question is addressed to. We're not going to interrupt them during the debate, but we will get to them at the end. You can do super chats at Entropy and on Odyssey. We don't have our YouTube, obviously, since we did get banned. Rest in peace, YouTube. But all right, so why don't we get started with openings? Richard, why don't you get us going?
Sure. Well, very happy to be here, of course. I look back upon 2016 with a great deal of nostalgia. There's some bitterness, there's some regret along the way, but there's actually a lot of nostalgia. It was a wild time, and it was one of the few times in my life where I felt like all of these new things were possible, and I felt like I was riding a wave. I was part of something bigger than myself that was going to lead towards great successes personally, nationally, globally, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's important now that it's, early 2022, that we look back upon that period skeptically and really understand exactly why Trumpism, MAGA, failed and why it was bound to fail. I would imagine that though my opposition is, he describes himself as a populist conservative, I don't think that he views the Trump administration as some wild victory that changed the system and accomplished what we wanted to accomplish or accomplished what Trump set out to accomplish in his own terms. And there are some reasons for that. Of course, huge opposition in the bureaucracy and the judiciary and the deep state. You could say there's even greater opposition in the mainstream media. I grant all that. But I think there are real fundamental structural problems for why Trumpism fails and why it will fail again, why movements like it will consistently fail, and so on. So let me try to get at what populism is. What does someone mean when they say they're a populist? Obviously, we think of the word popular. That is what you're saying is the most popular thing. But I don't think that's quite what it is. And I think even thinking in that way is a little bit deceptive. Populism can arise in a system, can arise in an election cycle, certainly can arise in a system when there's a great deal of angst and hyper polarity. And out of that division, there's a call for a kind of us versus them. That could be, Republicans versus the Democrats, or kind of Americans versus the world, or Americans versus the globalists. So populism is existential. And I think with regard to Trump, it was even more existential than that. I mean, the populist word in English has a lot of similarities with a German word that derives from folk, that is folkish. You could translate that word as populist. You could also translate it as ethnic or racialist or folkish, to use the direct English word. And I think that there was so much about Trump that was powerful in the sense that he was able to tap in to a general anxiety about white Americans' place in the world, that they felt that that was slipping away, that they felt like the government really wasn't their side. They weren't going to have a place in the sun. And so in that way, he tapped in to maybe the biggest hot button of them all, or the most electrifying third rail you could possibly imagine. I'll be brief here. And I'm sure there's a lot about the Trump failures that we can talk about, but I will just try to get at one dynamic, which I think is endemic to these types of movements, and is the dynamic that will ensure that any type of Trump movement, whether it's 2024 or beyond, will fail in the same way. First off, there is a complete lack of vision, or even a complete lack of a policy agenda. And so what often happens is that there's a sense that anything can change, the euphoria that I talked about a couple minutes ago. But there's actually no intellectual or ideological core that could allow something to change. And this comes from the emotional quality of populism itself. But I think there's also something a little darker and more sinister. And that is that another politician who was a bit of a populist, maybe in the deep sense, Enoch Powell, who's most famous for his, or most infamous, you could say, for his Rivers of Blood speech about immigration and demographics in Great Britain. He mentioned that conservatives want to, in some way, acknowledge the problem, acknowledge that hot button, and benefit from the problem, but never solve it, because solving it would be the end to their political careers. In other words, they are in effect grifting off the problem. There is no vision to solve something like immigration. There is no a way to solve a demographic transformation of the size that we are experiencing. And in a way, that would ruin the game for these populists. Populists want to endlessly talk about the problem, endlessly complain about libs or globalists or so on. They have no vision to enact policy. They have no ability to enact policy. And in fact, doing something about it would end this long-term grift that they've got growing. So I do not see any future for populism. Now, where we should go from there, that's a good question.
Begin to wrap that.
But yeah, I'll end it there. Sorry, I'm always long-winded.
All right, go ahead.
All right, Brittany, Todd, thanks for having me. Richard, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Rob.
So first off, let's talk about, so I was interested to see where you wanted to take this debate, Richard. So the idea of populism, I think that we should define it. For me, populism is a belief that people are fed up with their government and think that there's sort of an oligarchical type class that is controlling culture and politics. And so therefore they strive to end that stranglehold and want a movement that represents average people more. That populism could come on the left or the right, right? So I think that we see politicians that are populist in a sense that you see on the left. Bernie Sanders would be someone that sort of had this groundswell of people that were fed up with the current system. And to me, this speaks to something, because I see populism rising all around the world, and in particular the United States. So when you saw the Brexit movement, for example, that was a form of populism. When you see movements in France, Germany, etc., there's populist movements on the left and the right that are occurring there. In the United States, I always found it strange that I felt that the Occupy Wall Street people and the Tea Party people actually had more in common than they had against each other. They may have disagreed with solutions, but they were isolating similar problems. And I think that's both because they had this vein of populism. At its core, as a populist, what I mean most is that I want the corruption in our government solved. Now, I believe that politics is downstream of culture. And I think that because our culture has been dominated predominantly with an establishment sort of, I won't even say it's progressive or left wing, but it's a movement that's claiming to endorse the values of the progressive or the left wing. And all of our institutions are basically dominated by this belief, almost all of them. So when you look at the ones I'm talking about, it could be corporate America, the mainstream media, the entertainment industry, academia, tech companies, Silicon Valley, social media, places like that. So all of our narrative is kind of sort of coming from the same pro-establishment place. So much so that you even see like entertainers and stuff that used to say Bush lied, people died, now sticking up for war and things like that when Obama or Biden or someone like that does them. So that's where I see all of this push culturally and then politically it's being used as well to sort of usurp the will of the people and the issues that the people care about. Trump's not perfect, and we could talk about a lot of the things that he did that was a failure, but I voted for Trump for one reason and supported Trump for one reason. Not because I thought he was playing 4D chess or he was a genius, but because I felt the fact that he was a potential outsider. Even if you argue that he was just a phony outsider or he was grifting, I don't necessarily think that's the case, but even if it was the case, the people that have a stranglehold, and by that I mean the establishment people at the top of the Republican and Democratic Party, and the people that are really the movers and shakers like our bureaucracy, or as Richard said, the deep state, they didn't want a potential outsider. They didn't want Bernie Sanders, and they didn't want Donald Trump. So they took care of Bernie in the primary, and they thought that they would have their John McCain's, their Mitch McConnell's, etc. They would have them basically in shadow endorse Hillary Clinton because they knew that Donald Trump had no chance of winning because they believed their own garbage. And so Trump, by sheer fact that he was seen as a potential outsider, forced them by winning to out themselves as has never before seen. So we see the corruption of the FBI, of the media, the sycophantic propaganda that you see pushed at us from every one of these institutions and people in power. And Trump mobilized people on the right that had never voted in their life or didn't care. There were people in rural America that felt that they hadn't had a voice in culture and politics for 30 plus years. And finally, this billionaire comes and he speaks for them. And he drove enthusiasm up there. Now, Trump succeeded in, just because of who he was as a potential outsider, of outing the corruption. He failed in doing anything about the corruption. That is absolutely true. But populism is the only hope we have going forward. And we'll get to the two things that Richard said that where they failed. The first was that it lacks an ideological agenda, but the most important agenda is ending that corruption. We could have all the debates we want on healthcare for all or tax rates or immigration policies and things like that. You better hope that the FBI and the CIA and the people that run our government agree with you. Because if they don't, it doesn't matter what your opinion is or who wins that debate, because they are kingmakers that will just attack any presidency or any politician that actually wants to do real change. And the other argument he says was that they're grifters. And that's true. There'll be grifters in any situation, including populists. But what's the alternative? At least there's a better chance of upsetting the apple cart by going with new people that care about the average person rather than the traditional Republican and Democratic Party. And so when we get to open discussion here, as I issue my final comments here, I'll be interested to see who Richard Spencer wanted to win the presidency and which party he supports now.
Okay, I guess we can open up the floor then.
Okay, would you like me to address some of the... I was jotting down...
Yeah, no problem.
Points. Okay. It's funny because I don't think we actually disagree that much. I won't dispute your definition of populism. I think this, with that scene from Network, I'm mad as hell and I ain't going to take it anymore. That is populism in a nutshell. It is deeply emotional. It is justified in many ways. It is coming from somewhere. But raw anger like that can be kind of powerful and motivating, and it can be seen as dangerous by the establishment. The establishment doesn't want another January 6th. It doesn't want another, guy in the White House who was previously retweeting Mussolini. It doesn't want that. I agree. But the question really is, we're not in 2016 anymore. And so what does this actually lead to? And it seems like this only leads to where it is. Like there's not some theoretical Trump movement that we can conceive, of. We see it. It is right here. We know exactly what it leads to. It leads to January 6th. It leads to Marjorie Taylor Greene. It leads to, evangelical Christian preachers speaking in tongues, hoping that Donald Trump will win the election. That's what it is. Because if it doesn't have any kind of core, then where exactly does it go? In terms of corruption, there's a corruption in the United States is in a way legal, and it's so immense that it's hard to even fathom. It's not just someone, giving $1,000 under the table to someone. We're talking about mass amounts of billions of dollars. I mean, the corruption of the military industrial complex in Washington is, again, all perfectly legal and so immense that I don't know how this can possibly be solved. I mean, what is the answer to this corruption? Endless probes, that's not going to get anywhere. I mean, firing them all, deconstructing the administrative state, in the words of Steve Bannon, that just seems extremely unrealistic. And again, just not something that any of these people are actually willing to do. Politics are downstream from culture. Well, if that is the case, I don't agree with that sentiment, actually. And if that is the case, then why do we have the politics that we have? It's kind of that line, which was, popularized by Breitbart, has been repeated by a number of these people. What does it actually mean if politics are downstream from culture? Well, then this is our culture. We get what we deserve. Every nation gets the government it deserves. Another popular phrase. Or maybe you don't fully understand the culture you are living in because you're so fed up by politics. Another thing, what is my alternative? Yes, my alternative is to pursue other things intellectually. I won't do any kind of activism on behalf of populists. But also, I think there's actually quite a bit to be said for Democrats and mainstream Republicans. And I'm sure that will get your get you mad as hell, maybe, by saying that. Joe Biden has had a I don't know how to describe it, lukewarm presidency. It's no longer shiny and new. It kind of seems rusty and old at this point. Nevertheless, he actually has at least attempted more, not successfully due to Senate obstruction, but he has attempted more in terms of infrastructure, basic payouts, child tax credits, etc., than the populist ever dreamed of. Another person who supported those things was, at least the child tax credits, was Mitt Romney, by the way. Joe Biden has ultimately successfully, though imperfectly, managed a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. That is, he, unlike Trump, certainly unlike Bush and unlike Obama, has actually reduced the footprint of the U.S. empire. Trump talked a big talk. He talked a big talk about being a realist and isolationist. He also talked a big talk about being a hyper-Zionist. Well, the Zionists got more or less all that they wanted. Realist and isolationist, wow, it was a mixed bag. Maybe it could have been a lot worse. I'll grant you that. Biden has actually reduced the footprint. So the way I see it is populism exists in a kind of asymmetry in the world where there is a hegemonic, liberal, woke beast. It is the party that sets the agenda, that makes the news for the mass media, that actually does policy, etc. Then there is another force, which might be equally as strong, in fact, but it's this incoherent cloud of emotions and ideas, and it's called populism. So there's a hegemonic party that actually has to do things and deal with things. There is a cloud of populism that might be justified, mostly justified, in fact. I'm angry too. I am anxious about the fate of our people in the world, as you are. But it's also a cloud that includes that massive grift, that kind of lib-owning nonsense that you see with someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's a hazy cloud that can actually go buffoonishly violent, whether in the form of, say, BLM, which is kind of populist in its weird way, and January 6th. And which of these two forces, equally strong, arguably, is ultimately going to win and is ultimately going to solve some kind of problem? My view is that the hegemonic force will. And you kind of have to put up with the woke nonsense, which, by the way, accelerated under Trump, for whatever that's worth. I mean, transsexual questions were not an issue in 2014. They became totally mainstream during his tenure. So he was not able to confront any of that stuff. You have to put up with that if you actually want some kind of sane governing order. I think Biden has been sane on Afghanistan. He's actually been remarkably sane on this Russia question, which has cropped up. He's tried to do things that are imperfect, incomplete, etc., but are actually something, as opposed to just offering tax cuts or moving the embassy to Israel. So when I look at the two choices, yeah, it's very clear. I mean, I side with the deep state.
So, and you voted for Biden, right? So that is who you wanted to win. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So there's a lot to get to there. I'll try to kind of go in the order you went to and try to respond to this. The first kind of area that you talked about was that populism has no core of where to go. Well, that's not true, right? You could be a populist on the left or the right. Conservative populism certainly had things that they wanted to talk about. For example, immigration. Now, did Trump completely do everything that he wanted? No. And was the suggestions that he wanted to do, were they even the best things? I don't think so. I think the border wall was something that would have been somewhat effective, but to me, the best thing to do to end illegal immigration is to go after employers in the United States that are knowingly employing illegal immigrants. If you started to civilly and criminally punish people that were intentionally hiring illegals, you would stop the incentive for so many illegals to come. But
sure.
The problem is this: Trump himself is not an ideologue. One criticism of Trump that I think is legitimate is I think Trump wanted to be liked more than anything else. And I think that if people on the left were smarter, they would have just sucked up to him and probably got a lot more out of him, because he would have probably said, all the cool people like me. Everyone in the entertainment industry likes me, so I'm going to go along with them. You can see this in areas like, for example, where Trump started to suggest after the Las Vegas shooting, one of the shootings, he said, we're going to ban bump stocks. We're going to do this. We're going to have all these checks. And then his base was like, whoa. And you could tell he'd never really thought it through. But that's okay. Like, we don't need every president to be a complete ideologue or every politician. There are other ways that you could be effective. And one of the ways you could be effective is by being sort of a diplomat, bringing in the best people. Trump just happened to bring in the worst people. That was the problem. What he bragged about, bringing in the best people, was actually one of his weak suits. However, right, he did, and that's certainly true. That's a fair criticism. However, there was a core way to go with conservative populism, and he was right to suggest some of the things, and they'll fail in implementing them. So you say, what should we do? Well, the first thing we could do is end things like illegal immigration. We could be doing things to care about the actual people of this country, to stop sort of the censorship of people that is occurring in this country, average people, something that Trump should have did better, to stop sort of the stranglehold over the flow of information and the oligarchical kind of decision-making processes. I would disband the FBI. I would do it incrementally, but I would disband it. I would do the same with the CIA. Replace them with people that are replace those budgets with new agencies that are supposed to keep us safe from people that are actually threatening this country, as opposed to going after blue-haired grandmas and things like that. You could also do things such as out the corruption and out all of the shadiness that has been going on behind the scenes, and all of the corrupt, entrenched politicians. You could have outed all those sorts of things. Aside from that, the politics that Trump, his actual agenda, it was actually moving our country in a positive direction. The economy was humming along before COVID came along. We saw things that all of a sudden, that things that a lot of people on the left wanted was getting passed, such as prison reform and things like that. Now, I might not have been in favor necessarily of exactly how Trump went about all of this, but the country was doing far better than it's doing under time, going back to the same old that we got with Joe Biden. And make no mistake about it, Joe Biden's not running the show. He's basically a figurehead. And Ron Klain and the people behind the scenes are actually running this administration, and the people that were basically in power with Obama and the Obama administration is what's running this administration. So yeah, I think that outing that corruption is the first step. And we have decades upon decades of seeing that the average working class person in this country and the average person who basically just wants to be left alone by their government and given a chance to succeed with their family, they're getting screwed over more and more every year. And to say, well, at least the hegemon's doing something. At least the establishment's doing something. Yeah, it keeps us going along, the average person. It makes us more dependent on them every year. And with all the technological and economic growth that we're experiencing, the portion of the pie that the lower people and the middle class, working class people should be getting is incredibly smaller than it otherwise would be if we actually had politicians that were looking out for them. But they're not. So we could argue things like, oh, well, we're pleased with, exactly Biden trying to, send stimulus checks out and having child tax credits and things like that. But that's all just more going along to get along. We can see the massive inflation and things like that that's been caused by sort of these establishment policies. And we can see that people are more desperate now and more reliant on the government and more depressed because of these government policies, largely from these hegemons than before. You say you don't agree that politics is downstream of culture. How does that work? Of course it is. Because the advocacy that we see these politicians make is appealing to people's cultural beliefs. So they sort of dog whistle to the cultural beliefs. For example, the CIA doesn't give two hoots about people in wheelchairs. The Army doesn't care two hoots about pregnant women flying in airplanes. But they know if they make those an issue and put commercials out and talk about that sort of stuff, that it allows them cover for a large portion of our society, the portion that the culture is dominant from. It allows them cover because they say, well, we don't care if we're dropping bombs in Syria. We don't care if we just bombed a bunch of innocent children in Afghanistan. As long as the FBI is woke, as long as the CIA is woke, as long as the generals are woke. And that's how we saw some of the same people in 2004 that were most critical of sort of our military industrial complex and our intel agencies are now the biggest sycophantic followers of them. I literally had friends on the left that marched with me against the Iraq war that were coming out saying that I was xenophobic and racist for wanting to pull out of Afghanistan. You say that you're pursuing other things, which is fine. Like something I think we could both agree on. These issues are important, but you need to have a life outside of it. Your family and friends and things like that are most important. So don't get too depressed, no matter how grim of a picture we're painting here. I just thought I would say that as an aside. You say that Biden's lukewarm, but he's got more done. He is not. Biden has pushed more, spent more, and had the government involved more in your life. Under his watch, we've had the FBI go after angry parents that are furious about indoctrinating our kids in academia with critical race theory and other such things. We've had a new domestic agency to treat Americans as domestic terrorists. You say that they don't want another January 6th. I disagree. I think that January 6th was the best thing that happened for the establishment. That's why they didn't want the National Guard there, because they knew they could use this as a precursor to go after the people that they find to be undesirables. They're doing the same with people that make, don't want to talk about it because it could be streamed on YouTube, but medical decisions, I'll just say in general, people that make alternative medical decisions. We could see sort of the authoritarianism that's going after them from the Biden administration. Lastly, you say that the hegemony solves problems. They're solving problems that they create. The reality is America is a fantastic country. The people are fantastic people, and that we are growing economically, technologically, and culturally without the government getting involved in this. Granted, the culture has been kind of usurped by people that have a nefarious agenda, call them part of the establishment, communist, whatever you want to call them, Marxist. But we would be doing much better if we didn't live in this society where our organizations and our establishment, Democratic and Republican politicians created so many of the problems we're trying to solve. So I guess I'll leave it there and we'll leave you respond.
Okay. Do you want to jump in, Brittany, or do you want me to talk about something? We might go back and forth on a lot of these things.
We can do it shorter, like minute to minute. That'd probably work better because it's hard to remember.
Where did woke come from? If politics is downstream of culture, so did wokeness come from the American people?
No, so the idea of wokeness, right, basically came from this idea of what I call cultural Marxism, right, where they try to separate people in categories, most of the time immutable categories, as oppressor versus oppressed. And they understand by separating into those categories, it allows you to control people. So as long as, for example, white and black people are screaming at each other, They don't realize that the system that's supposed to be there governing for them isn't really doing anything to help the average person out in either of those populations. And so basically Marxism did that economically and it didn't work out. So what they figured out was, well, we could do it with everything, with any immutable. So we could say men are the oppressors, right? We could say straight people are the oppressors. We could say white people are the oppressors. And then we could attack them. And what that does is it allows all of these people that say, yes, I'm oppressed, to encourage, to embrace that victimhood as sort of a currency. And it's becoming one of the most important currencies we have. And so wokeism came, that's where it came from. It came from culture, academia it started in, but it's definitely infiltrated through academia, then through the entertainment industry. And now we see it at the top of corporate levels. And politics is kind of late to the game of jumping into that, actually.
Okay, I see what you were saying there. What I was suggesting was that woke, politics is downstream of culture in the sense that there's this American public and it kind of emanates culture and then politics picks it up. But then you went into Frankfurt School type stuff and cultural Marxism. It's a little bit of so it is a kind of elite theory. So I guess what I would suggest is, if that's how, wokeness is the most powerful force, cultural force right now. Mm-hmm. What does populism offer to replace it coherently? And not just they're mad at it, I get that, but what does it offer to replace it? And if it is created top down, that is through elites like the Frankfurt School, which is a very small group of people.
Sure.
Why should we focus on populism? If this is how culture changes, then why would we want to do populism?
The fundamental characteristic of populism is wanting the people to govern, wanting the people to have a voice, and understanding that we shouldn't have an oligarchical system or a system that's controlled totally by out-of-touch people or elite people, right? So the prescription for what each individual, again, we've already agreed, there could be left-wing populism, there could be right-wing populism, centrist populism, etc. But that's what unites them all, that they want the voice of the people to be heard. I think it intuits from there that what that implies is that the people all have something in common, that they all deserve to have a voice. And because of that, the way that fights against wokeism is it's completely antithetical to what I'm talking about, whether you call it cultural Marxism.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. I just
by focusing on individuals, right? Like, so what I say when I'm out there trying, like when I'm talking to people in the Republican Party, because I ran for Congress as a Republican, I have a lot of problems with the party at the top level, but I identify more as a Republican than Democrat. And what I tell people is one of the messages that we should have to people is we don't treat you as a skin color, right? We don't care. You're a person who happens to be black. You're a person who happens to be a woman. You're a person who happens to be straight, or you happen to be gay. What matters is that you are a unique individual. That's antithetical to wokeism, and I think populism leads down that direction.
Do you think that the races and the classes and the sexes would all be getting along were it not for this elite-driven identity politics?
Yes and no. There will always be problems. There will always be racial animosity. Anytime there are perceived differences or actual differences, there are going to be divisions. That's inevitable, right? And you can take that across anything. You can take it across geographic location. I mean, you can see in areas of the world, people that look to any outsider like they're the exact same race despise each other because they're from different ends of a city, or they're from different ends of a country, right? But I think the situation would be far better. It's like a scab. The more we pick at it, the worse it gets. It'll never completely heal, but we could get it to the point where it's almost irrelevant, or it's far more irrelevant than it is today. And this is backed up. The more that we've had movement, like race relations in this country are getting far better until people like Obama came along. Then once you saw like sort of the rise of Black Lives Matter and sort of that sort of focus on race, you started to see a counter rise of people, I don't know, like that would identify as white nationalists or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess I'm in the position of defending identity politics. First off, blaming Obama for that's a bit much. I might actually even defend Obama here. But the main thing is Trumpism. I mean, would you agree with my opening statement, at least to some degree, that Trumpism, he might not have just outright said it of, I am a white nationalist candidate. He never quite said that. But first off, he catered to it. And when he would say things like, why are we worrying about these dreamers? Americans have dreams too. He was evoking something or kind of playing footsie under the table. He actually got quite harsh when it came to Hispanics. He would just say, they're sending rapists and murderers over here. And I assume, some of them are good people. That he was pushing on some deep demographic racial angst in 2016. And that is a fundamental, just irreducible aspect of populist appeal. That I agree that Trumpism is kind of changing. In 2020, it remarkably appealed to Hispanics in surprising ways. I will grant all of that. I've talked about that quite a bit. But that there isn't the liberals who hate Trump, are they not right when they demonstrate that it's just a white thing? It is not about the entire country. This entire country has changed dramatically. I don't know where whites are now demographically, 60%, something like that. A bit higher in of the electorate. But he was tapping in to an existential angst that was fundamentally racial in character, and that wasn't just created by the Frankfurt School or something like that. It really has to do with America's racial history, America's identity across the 19th and 20th centuries as a kind of white man's country in North America in a changing world. That he was tapping into that. And it seems like with all due respect, it seems like you're giving a kind of kumbaya story about how there are these wicked, corrupt elites and they want to divide us. And, all people kind of in their hearts are populist. It kind of almost strikes me a little bit as a kind of Christian who believes that everyone kind of inherently believes in God. They might just not know it yet, or they might be actively denying it. We're all one here. But the fact is, we're not all one. And Trump could not have been elected if he did not appeal to that, ultimate third rail, that electrifying force of race and racial angst.
Let me ask you this, and I don't mean any disrespect by this, but I think in your position, there's a lot of conversation about you. So I'll just ask you your opinion straight up as opposed to interpreting from someone else. Sure. Do you consider yourself a white nationalist, or did you in 2016?
Yeah, I would say more so in 2016. I've kind of evolved a bit, but yeah, I think it's fair to say in 2016, riding high in the spotlight, it's like, yeah, this is about white nationalism. Yes.
And so that's changed for you now. It's not really relevant to what I'm about to say, but you no longer consider yourself a white nationalist?
I'm not sure white nationalists consider me a white nationalist, but I have evolved in my views. I certainly don't deny the reality of race or the importance of race, but I think in much of what I'm aiming towards, it's actually more of a spiritual and kind of civilizational question. So
okay. So let me say this, right? And I don't say this to be rude, but I think that the examples you gave to Trump being appealing to racialists, maybe you felt that way because of the beliefs that you had. And so when you heard him speaking, he was saying something that you interpreted because of your beliefs as speaking directly towards you. I didn't interpret it that way. For example, when Trump said, what I think that Trump's got a big mouth and he shoots from the hip, which in some senses I like, right? And sometimes it's not good, but sometimes it's good, because one of the criticisms people have with politicians all the time is, well, they're so scripted. Or if you even take politics out of it, right? We do this all the time with like our sports media. So you'll have a coach for a team and he'll give like Bill Belichick will be like, we're always ready for our opponent next week, blah, blah, blah. And then when you have a coach that goes off the script, everyone's like, whoa, you can't say that. But that's what everyone said they wanted. They wanted people's real opinions. So Trump spoke like someone that would speak like just sitting around with some buddies having a beer, and oftentimes that's problematic as a world leader, particularly the strongest world leader. So do I think when Trump said they're not sending their best people, they're sending bad hombres, like rapists and stuff like that, There's a lot of truth to that. For example, we saw international rights organizations that was saying 1 out of every 3 women that tried to cross the border was sexually assaulted in some way. And so the implication is that there is a lot of bad stuff that's coming over the border: coyotes, cartel members, people that are criminals in other countries, etc. I didn't interpret that as everyone of Hispanic origin is like that. I interpreted that you could say what was bigoted to those illegals and they happened to be Hispanic, but I didn't think that that was something that was necessarily racial. And I think that you see people like the Lincoln Projects, like Rick Wilson and stuff, that have said people that are worried about the border are 10-toothed rubes that are trying to stop the brown horde coming from the South. I personally have concerns about illegal immigration that has nothing to do racially. I don't give a shit if 100 years after I'm dead, if there are people that look like me. I do care that there are people that share the same values as me. So I don't care. And so I do think that a lot of illegal immigration is about intentionally eroding the middle class and the working class. And I also think that it will change our culture, but not because of racial reasons. And so it's not a racial thing to say that there are problems importing a lot of people that might not share our cultural beliefs, particularly those that came here illegally, and then giving them a bunch of stuff. But I don't think that Donald Trump was necessarily tapping into a race thing. There were certainly a lot of white people that aren't racist and don't consider themselves white primarily, that something about Trump spoke to them. But to me, it wasn't their race. Their race was almost indifferent to that, or it was so far down the bottom of the list. To me, it was more the culture and sort of the economic situation that they live in, like rural America. Is it true that rural America is disproportionately white? Yes, that's true. But I don't think that's the unique characteristic of it. The unique characteristic of it is they are people that have unique struggles, that are struggling economically. And unlike other groups that are struggling economically, there is no one sticking up for them. No one's even pretending to care about them. And so that's what Trump represented to them. So I don't think that it was racial. I think it was a group of people, many of whom may happen to have been white, but that said, this is something that speaks to me. And the fact that you're saying that Trumpism changed, and that's why he did so much better with Hispanics. He even did better than the average Republicans with blacks. I don't think that it changed. I think that a lot of the values that he was espousing, because they were sort of populist values and conservative values, were actually shared by huge swaths of the Hispanic and black population, because it turns out many of those people are very conservative and are very upset about the direction our culture and our politics are going.
All right. Many of those statements you made are turning me into a white nationalist. I was.
Don't blame me for that. I don't.
I'm going to revert back to my old ways. What is it? Is it 2016 again? Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory! Yeah. Wow. Okay. Where to begin with this? Let me try to. I don't want to just go and hammer on the racial issue, to be honest, although I guess I could. I think I said what I wanted to say. I think I would just be reiterating my statements about him evoking a certain kind of racial anxiety and racial angst. I think what I would say to offer something new is something that I mentioned in my opening statement, which is that I feel like it's very difficult to solve the demographic issue. In fact, solving it would involve things that I don't think are really politically possible. It would involve, I don't know, secession or repatriation of immigrants, etc. It would just be a tremendous thing that I don't think populists or Trump's white nationalist Trump supporters have even quite contemplated, and they certainly aren't things that are politically feasible. But so I think that's kind of in a way part of the problem, in the sense that the demographic issue is baked into the cake, and it's been baked into the cake for a very long time. There by 2010-ish, most births in the United States were to non-white mothers, and thus, even if all immigration were to cease tomorrow morning, and immigration is slowing down, by the way, not due to policy exactly, but even if all immigration were to just cease, America would still become a majority non-white country by 2055 or 2060. In other words, it would happen actually in a foreseeable amount of time. So this is baked into the cake, and there's no way to solve that issue. But I would never deny that doesn't operate as a kind of fundamental angst. Now, is Trump doing well with Hispanics? He is, because I think in many ways, populism, which claims to speak for all the people, we'll run our own lives, we don't need the government, etc., is one half of the deep polarization that we're seeing. Polarization that might actually be a little more powerful than race in America, as crazy as that sound. At least when people are polled, they will say that they are more worried about their son or daughter dating a Democrat than they are their son or daughter dating an African American. It's pretty profound. And within that polarization, you are going to split off a lot of Hispanics. Again, the Hispanic question is a very complicated one. I think Republicans have tried to use it a lot like the Southern strategy, in the sense that they've made Hispanics like blacks. I don't think that works. Hispanics, there's a lot of intermarriage between Hispanics and whites. Many Hispanics are effectively white. Many Hispanics are going to react very strongly like whites to woke culture and diversity and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a very complicated issue, and I don't think it's not going to work. We're not going to get 90% of Hispanics voting Democrat. I actually think it will be more like 50-50. And I think this kind of populist grift will keep going. But the issue is that racial angst, which is at the heart of it all, can't really be solved. It just can't. Outside repatriation of American citizens, which is almost unimaginable. And thus, these people offer no real solution, yet they constantly want to benefit. They constantly want to go back to that well of racial anxiety in order to win elections. And they are doing that. When liberals say that GOP, they're race baiting, they're dog whistling, they are 100% correct about that. In fact, they understate it, if anything. The GOP has been doing that for decades. That is their primary electoral strategy since the Nixon years. And they will continue to do that while offering no real solutions. And you seem to be, from the statements that I've heard, you seem to be more of a libertarian type. You don't want people dependent on the government and whatever. Fair enough. That's your perspective. I think there actually is a place for government in people's lives. I think there's a place for a robust welfare state. I think that is more or less what Trump was offering. Trump, in one of his books, endorsed wholeheartedly socialized medicine. There was a kind of hint that he was going to engage in some kind of Medicare for all or something like that in 2017. He said, we're not going to let people die in the streets. We're going to do this. No, instead, he went back to the typical Republican policy of, we hate whatever the Democrats do, but we don't offer anything as an alternative. Let's get rid of Obamacare. What we have instead is, it's kind of sort of Obamacare, except it doesn't work. And people remain unhappy. And so there's no real solution, and actually offering a solution would end the grift. The populist is a movement born out of emotion. I don't think they consciously recognize this, but unconsciously, you could say, they recognize that they can't actually even offer anything, because that would end that, endless source of emotion. Very similar to the pro-life movement. What would happen if Roe v. Wade were overturned? Well, a lot of those organizations would lose a lot of funding because they won. They were ruined by their success. I think populism has that same problem, which is it is based on complaining, owning libs, experiencing your own raw emotions. I'm mad as hell. I can't take it anymore. And it can't really offer a solution. Whereas the evil hegemonic deep state, which I support, at least has to govern, and it at least has to offer something. It has to worry about its own sustainability and whether it will survive or not, which is why I think, although I might be wrong, I hope I might be wrong about this, I don't think we're going to see a massive conflict with Russia, because that actually is a bridge too far. That's why Joe Biden, who supported the Iraq War, supported Afghanistan, just kind of gutted it up manned up and said, all right, we're leaving Afghanistan, and it's going to look horrible and we're going to lose prestige, but we're just doing it because we have to, because he actually has to govern. Populists can indulge in emotions endlessly because they don't actually have to do anything, and they get paid for doing nothing.
Okay, so first off, there was an interesting conflation there. So you talked about sort of the racialism grift of the Republican Party, but I don't like the establishment Republican Party. I don't think the Republican Party is synonymous with populism, which is what we're talking about.
But Trump amplified it.
Okay, but so let's talk about. So there's two main points that I want to get to here. The first is, I think you're right? Like, I'm glad that you're no longer a white nationalist. I understand that there are people that have reason to be upset based on their race. First off, you should be allowed to take pride in whatever you want. If you want to take pride in your gender, your race, your sexuality, and not only that, if you see things that are problems in that community you identify with and you want to speak up about those problems, perfectly legitimate. People upset about the treatment of inner city blacks have every right to say, we want to start a movement that puts, the spotlight on the treatment that's occurring. I agree with it. I might disagree with their solutions, but they absolutely are right that there's unique problems. And that's true of any race. That's true of whites. It's true of blacks, Hispanics, Asians. It's true of any gender. It's true of any sexual orientation, etc. So I don't have a problem with that, but you're right. What's the solution? And I do think you're right. People don't understand what white nationalism would be. That the horrors that would entail, trying to have and when you talk to them, every white nationalist is different. They all have a different strategy for what they want. Well, we would allow people with 90%, white ancestry in our country. Well, what about the people that are 95% that say we don't want the 90% people? Well, there'll be a special enclave for them. And so we're going to end up with 500 countries where the United States was. So
I'm 101. You have to be 100. You have to be more white than me in order to be in my country. I don't want to be in an ethno state that would have me as a member. Yeah, that's how hardcore I am.
There you go. I've never bothered to look into my ancestry. I basically don't give a shit about it. So when I debate white nationalists, I don't know what to say, what my ancestry is. I don't really care. But here's the problem. So you're right. In a sense, regardless of what you think of multiculturalism, it's here to stay in the United States. There is no way that that's ending. And like you said, even if we ended immigration, I agree with all that. Even if we ended immigration, eventually, because of the birth rate situation and things like that, whites will no longer be the majority. There'll be first a plurality, and then eventually there'll be a minority. But the question is, what do we do about that? Right? At least adopting a mindset that says, well, we treat everyone as individuals. We don't have policies based on race, which, by the way, we see the Biden administration doing horrifically, such as giving money to poor farmers based on their race, such as giving medications
I'm listening.
to people.
Just 1 second.
Yeah, no, as long as you're listening.
I'm still listening. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So we see these race-focused policies, all they do is exacerbate the situation. So if a problem is going to exist no matter what, the best we could do is to seek to minimize its importance. And the best we could do is attempt to be as colorblind as possible, at least with our politics. If our politics is trying to level the scale by picking and choosing winners and having different laws or different sort of programs for people based on race, it will always create more animosity, always. And so that gets to the interesting point where you say Republicans and you say Trump amplified it. This sort of racial grifting, in what way? Because they correctly call out when the other side, when the Democrats, who are the party of identity politics, plays these sort of identity politics. And so the argument is, and I hear this argument all the time.
When he said that Baltimore is full of rats and so on, yeah, that's
it is. It's a shithole.
Blowing a dog. I know it's true in certain parts of Baltimore. Certain parts of Baltimore are fine, but he's blowing a dog whistle. And the whole BLM. I mean, I would say in a nutshell, the whole BLM situation, which we saw last summer, just represented that kind of tragedy of Trump as an authoritarian, as did January 6th in many ways. So with the BLM riots, we had COVID, we had lockdowns and quarantines, and the people just burst out of their homes. I think in a way because of COVID to a very large degree. They burst out, took to the streets, started talking about BLM and George Floyd, and it became this huge movement, even a larger, more intense movement than the Trump movement. Again, it led to riots in many circumstances, and in many circumstances, cities were burning, places were burning, etc. Trump, he wanted to be the type of Nixonian fascist who would just send in the National Guard and just clean house. But he couldn't do it due to maybe weakness in his administration, maybe a little hesitancy, maybe incompetency, maybe the fact that the liberal media would lambast him, maybe the fact that he was threatened by impeachment. All those things were at play, but he didn't do it. But he ultimately benefited from it. And so throughout that summer, you would have endless reports on Fox News and on social media. This is Joe Biden's America. This is what Biden looks like, even though it was Trump himself. So Trump demonstrated his weakness and the kind of infeasibility of the kind of authoritarianism that he is, embodies, and then ultimately benefited from that failure. So people in Iowa who were miles and miles away from any BLM riot or peaceful protest would see it on social media or Fox News and get deeply agitated and go vote for Trump. And actually be
but he
an
still
intense
lost. He
Trump
didn't
supporter.
benefit that
That's
much.
a grift. That's what I'm not talking about a grift like Tim Pool, like send me your super chats or whatever while I misinform you about literally everything. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like a much, much deeper grift, which is at the very heart of the right wing and at the very heart of populism.
Now, I disagree. I disagree completely. I think so. Even what you said there, like what you're doing, remember, you're now endorsing the Democratic Party, right?
Yes.
Which exacerbate all of those things tenfold of what you're, even if I would concede your point about Trump on this, when it comes to the racial division in this country, if we just look at that example, but there's dozens of others, but just the example of riots under Black Lives Matter, we literally saw our institutions that favored the Democratic Party all kind of sort of coalesce around this. Well, it's mostly peaceful. Well, violence is the language of the unheard. And like
Right.
people were told over and over in this Orwellian way as fires raged in the background, it's mostly peaceful. These people are okay. Our now Vice President Kamala Harris actually put a bail fund up for the people in the city where they burned down a police precinct. All of this occurred. They attacked May 30th and 31st, 2020. They attacked the White House. They lit a guard station on fire outside the White House, and many were chanting that they wanted to get in and remove Donald Trump and do worse to him, which I won't say. But so the idea that you're now embracing the politicians that fed into that, even if you were right about Trump, wouldn't you say, well, I'm certainly not going to embrace the side that cheered that on and made it possible? That's even worse.
I'm a pretty independent guy. I'm not a, blue no matter who or deep devoted Democrat. But all I'm saying is that if one party is going to govern, it will be that party. I would also add a little bit of nuance to what you just said. Wokeness is the ideology of our age. Wokeness, the word might be kind of overused. I think people will be like, the wokesters want us to wear masks or whatever. It's over. But that general leftist core based around white guilt, based around undermining colorblind liberalism, call it critical race theory, call it whatever you want. That thing, that ideological core, yes, it's part of the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is the natural party of governance. But it is in a way bigger than the DNC, and it is going to outlast the DNC, and it triumphed under Trump. I mean, look, rewind 5 years or maybe a little bit more. The notion that in a town hall debate, we would see mothers talk about transitioning their children on CNN, and pretty much all politicians would nod along, including a lot of Republicans. That would be unfathomable even like 6 years ago. Now it's normal. All of that occurred under Trump, which leads me to believe that Trump either offers no resistance to that big woke dynamo that is out there, or else he actually kind of feeds into it.
So
I'm not actually sure which one, but he can't stop it.
Okay, but you're saying that
it's not
you're
like
against...
I created wokeism because I voted for Biden or something. I know you're not saying that exactly.
But that's what makes no sense about your position. So you're like, I'm against this wokeism, and I don't think Trump did enough to stop it. Hell, it may have even encouraged the woke people to become even more extreme. So now I'm going to side with them. I'm going to vote with them and embrace their party. It makes no sense.
What I'm saying is that wokeism is bigger than the Democratic Party, and thus it doesn't really matter. The question really is which party is hegemonic and thus benefits from actually governing and doing things. Democrats.
Well, and that's why I say that politics is downstream of culture. And I would argue that populism is bigger than Donald Trump or bigger than the Republican Party as well. I would say that there are failures that both of those parties have had that you can't just put on populism. And so to me, the ideals of fighting back against this woke ideology and saying that we are all individuals, that we don't judge people or treat people with bigotry based on immutable characteristics like their race is exactly what populism is offering. We treat everyone as individuals. The foundation of this country was founded on the idea of the individual and the idea that we have personal freedom and personal responsibility. I don't care about your immutable characteristics. And neither should true populists. They should care about wanting individuals to have a say in their governance. Now, that doesn't mean, like, this is something I wanted to mention earlier, that doesn't mean that there's not a role for government. I'm not saying that I'm a total anarcho-capitalist or something like this, or I don't even consider myself a libertarian. But what I'm saying is right now, with the way our government's going and how corrupt it is and how little the voice of the people on the left or the right actually matter in the grand scheme of things, now is a time to adopt a populist approach until that is fixed. And real quick, I want to say about like I don't understand this position of, well, all of this bad stuff occurred under Trump. What did you want? Did you want Trump to send in the National Guard?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I would have absolutely supported sending in the National Guard. Yes.
But the problem is the reason that he had to send in the National Guard was because Democratic governors and mayors and Democratic people in the media and all of our institutions, academia, the entertainment industry, were either quiet about or were cheering on riots that were occurring from left-wing people, all in the name of this cultural idea of wokeism. And
right. So thus populism and Trumpian authoritarianism can't work.
But it could work.
Why try something that can't work?
What do you mean? Just because Trump failed, that's it? That's the end of the attempt?
Well, he didn't just fail. It would be one thing if he slipped on a banana peel as he was going to sign an executive order to crush the riots. But that didn't happen. As you said, there were massive structural forces that are probably more powerful now 2 years on than they were in 2020. And yet we're going to try this all over again. It is going to fail all over again if it's successful. I think Trump might, good Lord, Trump might be our next president. I'll grant you that, actually.
He might. Him or DeSantis right now, I would say, are the front runners. I would say Biden, despite you saying he's lukewarm, is pretty far down the list of being president in the next one.
Everyone underestimates Biden, and they all, including myself, and they always get burned. So I wouldn't say that. But Trump might very well win in 2024 under the changed dynamism, but a very similar dynamism to 2016 and 2020. He might do it again, and the failure will come again. At some point, you when there's a ceiling on something, you just stop it. If something's not going to work, you move on to something else. Again, I'm speaking personally. This is what I do. But, I don't, it's not just out of like some kind of weird personal quirk or something. Like it actually is something that I've thought through, and I don't want to engage in populism ever again.
Well, so here's where I think you go wrong.
Okay.
I think that you would probably criticize people that I would say are basically just Trump worshipers. Let me give you an example of this. So I have a small channel. I don't have a big reach or anything like that. But the 40, 50 people that were watching me live when I was streaming back in like March of 2020, almost all of them were Trump supporters. I was a Trump supporter. I was offered a job by the Trump campaign to just do little local stuff, but they wanted me to get rid of my social media. So I said no, because I like doing the videos and stuff. And then like a week later, Trump came out and was endorsing, certain policies of locking down over certain issues, which I won't mention the medical issue that he was talking about. But all of a sudden I had all these conservative Trump supporters that any other situation would say, it's my rights. Basically libertarians or, constitutional conservatives are like, I don't want the government infringing on my rights. All of a sudden, because Trump said it, they were like, yeah, we're good with this. We're good. Go ahead. Lock us down. It's fine. And there are groups of people, which I'm sure you would criticize, that worship the man. It didn't matter. Trump could come out day one and say X, and then come out day two and say Y, and these people would say, okay, now I believe Y. And I think that that's wrong. But I think you're doing the same thing in the inverse.
Okay, hold on. Let me actually jump in just to be productive. And I'm not just trying to be contrarian.
No, it's fine.
I actually think that the cult of personality is one of the most powerful things about Trumpism. And one of the, if Trumpism could ever govern, it would actually be through a cult of personality. And cults of personality have actually been wildly successful in terms of agenda setting throughout 20th century in certain controversial regimes of the right and left. So if Trump actually, like, I agree that populism is kind of bigger than Trump, and it's an emotional thing that isn't quite, him exactly. But if it's going to actually have an agenda and govern, it's going to have to function through someone like that. Because if it doesn't have something, some place where the rubber hits the road, then it's simply going to be vague emotional whining, which is all I see from the right. Like,
okay,
if Trump, like, Trump's cult of personality might be the best thing about him. Like, that's how he could actually get something done, would be like, this is the Trump way. I'm going to take care of everyone. Go. Like, that actually could be a successful governing strategy. The Democrats don't quite, they have a little, I mean, there's a minor cult of personality around AOC or whatever, but they govern in different ways than that. But it seems like a populism actually could govern. So again, you're trying to create some kind of like rarefied populism out in the ether, as opposed to the one that you actually have. Trump was successful. There's always, there for a long time, there has been a lot of energy. I can actually remember, I'm old enough to remember, back in the late 90s, there was actually a lot of populist, anti-government, even kind of violent anarchist energy out there. If it's ever going to accomplish anything, it actually has to function through one man. When the alt-right, I know everyone's gonna, Bruce Spencer's so arrogant. When the alt-right was actually functioning, it was functioning through one individual. That's just how these things have to work. And populists themselves hate that because they have egalitarian instincts. And it's about us and our team and our group and anonymous people and whatever. That's all bullshit. Like there is no populism without Trump. And I don't think DeSantis would work for the very reason that Trump mentions. He's right about this. He's boring as hell. Okay. Trump is totally nuts. All of Trump's supposed liabilities are his greatest assets. The tweeting, the insane speech patterns, the racism, the vulgarity, all of those things make him powerful. Those are not liabilities. Those are assets. And if you're going to actually govern in some way, and I take you, you've been a very good debater. You're a serious guy. You want to get something done. I believe that. I'm giving you my unsolicited advice. If you're actually going to govern in some way, it's going to have to be through a Trump cult.
Okay, so first off, I disagree with you on the racism part of Trump, but neither here nor there. We already went through that. So what we were talking about when I specifically said that is there are people that are willing to accept whatever Trump says, even if he goes against sort of the ideology that they claim to have supported Trump for. So you're right? Of course, because humans are fallible and we need someone to get elected in positions of power, or not even elected necessarily, just to have some sort of cultural power, right? And in order to have some sort of cultural power, if you're just bland, even if your ideas are best, you won't get eyeballs on you. And even if you get eyeballs, you won't get people that are passionately in favor of you. And that's sort of what it takes. I don't disagree with that, but my criticism still stands of the people that want to say, I think that this movement's about Trump and solely about Trump. And they're willing, because Trump's only as good for that sort of movement as long as he's governing in a way that works for that movement. If Trump, like, for example, if you're a communist and you vote for someone who says they're a communist, and the first thing they do is start bailing out a bunch of corporate interest and, making tax cuts and things like that, you wouldn't say, well, yes, now all of a sudden I'm for tax cuts as a communist, because, right? It only makes sense if that person with charisma and with power. And let me be clear here, despite some criticisms I have of Trump, I will never approach him in terms of his charisma, in terms of the way that he could get a crowd and get eyeballs on him. You either loved him or hated him. Like, Trump brought in the eyeballs of people, and he brought the passions out of people. That's all an asset. That's all true. But I disagree with you that populism wouldn't have occurred without Trump. For example, we see massive amounts of people now that are getting fed up with what's happening to children in schools. Do you think that Youngkin, one, because of Trump. No, he won despite Trump. He won because there is a populist movement of people saying parents should have a say in what their children are being taught. And that's why Youngkin won. That was the issue. And because parents were upset that our government locked down schools and they didn't want their children to be locked down. So we have tangible, that's where I think you're going wrong and where I was getting to. Despite the fact that Trump lost through some self-airs and through some of this sort of giant juggernaut that he was facing, this sort of collaboration between sort of bureaucracy in DC, all of the major institutions aligning against him. You know, Professor Robert Epstein, for example, said that up to 16 million votes could be swayed by Google itself or by the parent company of Google that controls YouTube and things like that. So that was kind of the argument I had with people talking about theft of the election was taken before the election. When we allowed sort of our mainstream culture and our narrative to be dominated so much that stories critical of Joe Biden were being censored 2 days before the election, yet any garbage about Trump was being pushed out there, that's what should worry people, that they were able to drag someone across the finish line like Biden, who basically didn't campaign for the last 3 months. But anyways, we still, despite the fact that Trump lost, say what you will about him, we see sort of more and more people becoming distrusting of the government and understanding that they are inept or corrupt and that they are interfering in people's lives in ways that they shouldn't. Now, I'm not saying that all of those people are going to push someone like Ron Paul that I liked and that he'll end up, or a person like that will end up the next president. There is going to have to be people with charisma and entertainment value that kind of take up the torch. But it doesn't have to be one person. And those people are only as good as that they are actually advocating for the people. I favor someone that's conservative, but you can see that this populism is strong on the left as well. That's why there are people like AOC and Bernie Sanders. It's not like Bernie's kind of a strange guy because he's kind of antithetical to what you're talking about. He doesn't really seem to have, he has a quirkiness, but he doesn't, you know, he's a kind of a career politician that was kind of soft-spoken and yet he had huge movement, particularly amongst young people, because of the populist message. It was just the populist message I didn't like that was on the left.
Fair enough.
So one of the things I wanted to ask is, I think that when it comes to, and I know you're no longer, I don't know if you identify as the alt-right or not now, but I've always wondered this, and I argued, like, I've known you somewhat from, you know, just being in the mainstream in 2016. I always thought that the Democratic Party made more sense for people that were white nationalists anyways, because it's a very similar argument. The focus on racial identitarianism is prolific amongst the left and amongst the Democratic Party. I feel that the white nationalists just say, yeah, you're right to have that focus. We just think that we deserve a seat at the table. And we want, you know, we think the same things. And I think I've even heard you say before that one of the biggest growths of the alt-right and sort of white nationalism was movements like Black Lives Matter and things like that, because it's sort of two sides of the same coin. Do you like agree with that sentiment that it makes more sense?
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a kind of weird paradox because, you know, I think it's actually fair to say the Democratic Party is about identity politics in the sense that it will recognize certain groups as themselves, as a being, as an identity, and it prides itself in that. And you even see kind of funny times where Democrats will actually recognize whites. Hillary Clinton, when she was running against Barack Obama, made some statements. I can go look up the exact statement, but she basically said, you know, well, you know, Barack Obama, he's a great speaker, but, you know, I'm talking about the policies that reach, you know, hardworking white Americans. I mean, it was a pretty brazen thing, maybe even more brazen in some ways than what Trump said. But yeah, I think that's actually true. But it is funny. It's a kind of paradox because one of the things that alienates me from other white nationalists is that they really are, at the end of the day, racist Republicans. Like they do see stuff that I've said in this debate as just a betrayal. They resonate with the GOP, and the GOP, what is it about? It's all about kind of like yesteryear's liberalism. It's all about color blindness, and we don't see race, and identity politics is toxic, and all this kind of stuff. It's a weird contradiction, and I'm not sure I can quite explain it, but I think it does, you know, make sense in a way that I'm Democrat.
Yeah, and I think that I'm seeing more of like a form of socialism, white nationalists, like white nationalists that identify as more
Yes.
of socialists. I'm starting to see that more. And I think that what people don't understand out there, right? There's just this, it's always been a strange thing to me because sort of like, how do we define the right versus the left, like traditionally? I hear this argument all the time. People will say, if you're from Europe, you'll say, actually, there is no left wing in the United States. You know, that it's the Democratic Party center right and the Republican Party's far right. And it's like, well, it depends on how you define that. If I define right wing as fiscally conservative, well, there's no right wing in the United States because there ain't no fiscal conservatives in the Republican Party.
Right.
They spend just as much. By the way, it's something that I find ridiculous. One of the things I criticize Trump for and criticize my fellow Trump supporters is they couldn't wait to criticize Obama for spending, but when Trump was spending at a bigger clip, all of a sudden it was okay when my guy's doing it. And I disagree with that idea fundamentally. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make here is like it seems odd to me that because when something would happen, when a white nationalist would be in the news, that people would automatically say, "Oh, conservatism, Republican," and they might vote Republican. But that idea, the ideology that they're coming from, like you said here, I think that it stems or it's rooted in the exact same type of ideology that we see that's kind of the predominant with the Democratic Party. And I just wonder, given that you seem to agree with that, do you see the dangers then of voting Democrat if we want to get out, if you want to move on from sort of that white nationalist ideology?
Oh, no. I mean, look, no, I don't see any dangers in that. I don't think you're going to end. I think your desire to get beyond race or color blindness or whatever, it's us versus the government. It's not black versus white or something. I find that stuff fatuous.
But just to interject real quick. So you think, is that still a battle that you think's worth fighting of like whites versus blacks?
I don't think white nationalists I mean, look, and this is, beside the point in many ways, but white nationalists who are deeply concerned about, say, immigration, I think that battle is lost and we need to move forward. I think that if we're going to ultimately confront something like wokeness, it will be on a spiritual and ideological level. I don't think it's just about getting rid of some politicians or something. I think it's actually much, much deeper, and that ideology is much older. So, I mean, I'm just concerned with ideological and spiritual matters. And,
well, I agree with you. That's why
most white nationalists, even though they'll talk about that and they'll talk about like the high culture of the white race or whatever, they're just talking about that. It's just words basically to them. I mean, they care about, immigration primarily is their issue. And, again, their immigration is slowing down at this moment. Most of that has to do with COVID. But I think it actually might even bespeak a kind of general demographic, like whole scale demographic decline in the United States.
Now,
and a kind of end of the American century. So
if I can interject real quick, I don't know that that's true. Maybe for legal immigration, but I don't have
legal immigration is petering off objectively.
Legal is, but not illegal, correct?
Illegal immigration has always been kind of seasonal and cyclical, though. I mean, illegal immigration was much higher 20 years ago.
Mayorkas just said today, he said that this is the worst year we've seen in 20 years, possibly ever.
Well, who said that?
Mayorkas, he's I forget what his title is.
I don't know who that is, but illegal apps, just objectively speaking, border apprehensions, if you're going to measure illegal immigration in some way, it was worse in the turn of the century. I can actually remember this. I remember I was in college or something at the time. I mean, my mother said she was like doing flea market shopping in Mexico because I grew up in Texas. And when she went to her hotel, you could just, you looked out your window, you would just see dozens of illegal border crossings. It was just happening right before your eyes. I mean, it's almost kind of funny. But anyway, yes, it was worse. It can be bad now. It's often very seasonal. I mean, COVID has led to the decline in illegal immigration. It's now probably back up because the economy's going again. It's seasonal and so on. But again, Mexico itself is undergoing a demographic decline. So I think we're kind of like, I think all of those arguments, the kind of white nationalist arguments about immigration it's missed the boat. Those arguments are very 1990s, and I don't think they're really addressing like the serious issues of demographics that are facing us, which is a general demographic decline and a kind of end of the American century.
Okay, so I'm sure. Here's what I think. I feel like that I could bring you over to my side here, right? Because I think that there are things you're saying that are basically agreements with me. For example, when you said you disagreed politics were downstream of culture, but then basically you understand the importance of it's like, look, there might not be a political solution to this. It has to be spiritual or something like that. And then when you take that in the equation with, you're also saying these things are inevitable.
What I mean is we're semantic problem here. When I hear Breitbart say politics are downstream for culture, or Steve Bannon, what I get from that is he's saying that there's this kind of the people and the will of the people, and politicians are kind of expressing that and they're late to the game. The distinction that I'm making is that culture, spirituality, and politics are top-down phenomena. So they are elite-based entities. And culture is of all kinds, including popular culture, is an elite game. So
I don't disagree with that.
Downstream of politics. Like the fact that what is the big cultural change in America? Like you can tell whom someone voted for almost immediately when you meet them, by their dress, by they kind of wear their class on their sleeve, and so on. That they are Trumpism and MAGA wasn't even about politics. It certainly wasn't about policy. It was kind of about culture and lifestyles and so on. All of these things are downstream from politics. And so all I'm saying is that history and culture occurs on an elite level. And in the small way that's possible for me, I want to reach an elite level that can actually affect things. Populism is fundamentally bottom up. It is about tapping in to the emotions of the people. And I feel like that is a losing game because it's based on a misunderstanding of history.
Okay, so regardless of that sort of semantic difference, because we've already talked, what I wanted to focus on is you kind of acknowledge that this is an inevitable problem, that demographics inevitably is going to be a problem, and that you also understand that maybe a spiritual or sort of ideological approach to it is better than necessarily a political approach. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. We need to reject sort of, because it's inevitable, and like there's just no way. Like, and this is what I want to tell the white nationalists out there listening. There is no way. It's not going to happen. You're not going to turn the United States into a whites-only nation or part of it. You're not going to. I morally think that's reprehensible. I strategically think it's stupid, right? And it's just not practical. It can't happen. So what do? This multiculturalism, if you don't like that experiment, it's here to stay in this country. And so what do? And the best we could do, although there is no solving it, there is no utopia, there is no ending this problem, the best we could do is seek to put as little focus on those differences as possible and seek to maximize the things we have in common. That's what we should do. The Democratic Party and sort of the cultural milieu behind the Democratic Party is antithetical to everything you're talking about. It is the party of identity politics. And just because you might think it governs better, something that I totally disagree with. I think that even the situation with Afghanistan, you're right. It was Trump's weakness that he didn't rely on his gut and pull out of Afghanistan. And he tried to pull out of Syria and they lied to him. They lied about how many troops were there, right? But now we see we're on the cusp of another war. With Biden, we're on the cusp of right back to Russia being the enemy and kind of saber rattling against them. So just because, even if you say, well, they're getting things done, governance, if the big issue that we need to focus on is sort of culture and sort of like division that's being caused there, then I think supporting the Democratic Party is literally it's literally the worst thing that we could do. And instead, what we need to do is recognize, although it's not perfect, although there are sins of the past, that we need to, as a country, try to be as colorblind as possible moving forward. And that might require strong people of strong character and strong charisma to put that message out there. But I think that that message is already there. And so when you say that there's a lot of grifting going on with populism, there might be a difficulty in coming up with, there's no clear answer to how you solve it. But the first thing you do is stop causing more harm. And so by focusing on all of these racialized issues or issues about gender and focusing on divisions on those, we're making the problems worse. And I think that the first thing we could do is say, stop endorsing those people that are making the problems worse. And then we move forward from there.
Okay. I've already addressed this in many ways. The racial issues are much deeper, and Democrats are the only party that will actually govern. There you go. We can take.
Okay. Like, I don't know if you're ready for questions or not.
Yeah, we can get to the Q&A if you guys want. Okay. So let's see here. We got some super chats from NHP. Thank you guys. Since we are unable to get them anywhere else. Well, on Odyssey, but all right. So from let me go from the start. From Audible Dude, he said, first question for Bugman. Please explain Trump's first 2 years and the inaction associated with controlling all branches of the American government. I'm not sure who he means by Bugman. That literally could be either of you with this chat. So
my nickname was Bugs growing up because I had big eyes. I don't know that that's someone from my childhood, though.
I think it might be to you, Rob.
Okay, yeah, I'll explain. So, yeah, Trump was ineffectual. The problem was Trump's biggest weakness, and it's understandable, right? Who was he? The truth is, as president, you have a limited amount of time and a limited understanding. For example, if we have a pandemic, you can't expect the president to be an epidemiologist. And if we have an economic crisis, then to be an economist and a foreign policy expert. So at some point, you're going to have to delegate some sort of authority. And the reality is, most of the governance that Richard's talking about isn't done at the presidential level. Most governance is done by a bureaucracy, which I would say deep state's an accurate term. And that bureaucracy is there to stay. Yeah, you can switch who the figurehead is or who the person at the top is, but that bureaucracy remains, and it remained under Trump. And so who were you going to appoint to these things? Who could you trust? You know, I think Steve Bannon he could have trusted. But many of these positions, he ended up, despite his braggadocious nature saying, I appoint the best people, he literally appointed the worst people. And so what happened was we saw unprecedented leaks. We saw unprecedented sabotage from inside the administration because many of the people, like just look at the Ukraine impeachment of Trump over the Ukrainian situation, sort of the first impeachment. It was palpable how everyone from sort of the Defense Department and everyone from sort of our foreign policy departments and things like that, how they were like, it's our foreign policy. Trump was upsetting our foreign policy. And that's the reality. Trump should have cleaned house. And that's one thing that you could say that Biden's better at. The Democrats don't care. They're ruthless. They'll kick anyone out. Joe Biden is literally stripping people of honorary degrees right now. Like, that's what his administration's up to. They're just like, that's how petty they are. They're just like, no, we'll get rid of anyone that we perceive as not 100% being ideologically on our side. And so that was Trump's weakness, and that's where he failed. He trusted people that he shouldn't have. He should have. Bill Barr was a disaster. Jeff Sessions was a disaster. He should have declassified all of the corruption in the coup that went against him from the FBI from the get-go. He didn't. And sadly, after January 6th, he was basically hamstrung because it was made aware to him that he was going to be impeached and he would have been removed from office had he started doing things that were against the establishment line. So, yeah, I think Trump... Again, he succeeded in, not because he's a genius, in outing the corruption, but he failed in actually doing much to stop the corruption going forward.
Do you think Trump was corrupt at all?
He could have been. I tend to think not, but he could have been. It's irrelevant to the end of the day because I wasn't, like, I think that the whole 4D chess, the people that were saying that about Trump, I just always thought it was ridiculous. Trump was just seen as, imagine that you have total control over the Bushes and the Clintons. And so if it's Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton, great. Then the FBI wins. The military industrial complex, they win. Wall Street, the people at the top of like Goldman Sachs and stuff, they win. They know that they could trust whoever's in there to basically go along with what they want. But you don't want some outsider like potentially Bernie or potentially Trump coming along. I tend to think in his heart, Trump wasn't an ideologue. He just wanted to be popular and liked. But I do think that he actually cared about the average people in this country. And I think he just wasn't effective in enforcing policy.
Narcissist, and you were right when you said earlier that all you have to do is feed his ego and you can really get whatever you want from him. That's true. He just wanted to go for the loudest cheers. Oh, where'd he go? He'll be back. Actually, the next question was to him. So let me see if I can find ones for you while we wait for him to come back. All right, so from Neon Noerr, thank you for the super chat, by the way. Rob, America was turning into a post-racial utopia, and then a bunch of Jewish communists spent a few million and unleashed the POC hordes, and all hell. Just lost my place as that beeped. Hold on a second. Let me just read it over. Okay. Rob, America was turning into a post-racial utopia, and then a bunch of Jewish communists spent a few million and unleashed the POC hordes, and all hell let loose. Don't you think that that's always going to be a weakness and possibility in a state like the US?
So first off, the Jewish thing, I just think is totally irrelevant, and it's something that I think white nationalists want to focus on, and I just find crazy. It's a crazy distraction, and it's just I have no time of day for it. To the point of, were we entering a post-racial utopia? No, we weren't. Racism will always be a problem. Bigotry based on difference, prejudicial behavior based on differences, stereotypes based on all of these things are inevitable. They could get better. They could decline, and I think that they were declining. But certainly there are people that had an agenda in maximizing those differences and pushing. That's true. But Richard's right earlier to kind of call me out a little. It's not just that Obama did all of this, right? This is, again, where I'm saying that politics is downstream of culture. Obama came after we had years and years of people doing this in academia, pushing for this. I know I was a debater from 2003 in college debate, right? I did college debate. You would not believe, that's the left of the left, right? You wouldn't believe how many rounds I walked in and said, why won't you acknowledge your privilege as a white person? You should forfeit this round because you're white, right? And outside of that world, if you were just in the real world, white black people were getting along more and more every day. But in academia, it was being maximized. And I think that then got into the political sphere. And certainly there were people that were trying to intentionally push that difference. And it feeds on each other. The more the people push on that on one side that say, oh, we're doing this to, for black people or for people of color, etc. What that does is it drives up people on the opposite end of the spectrum that say, well, we're going to do it. We're going to play that same racial identity game, but we're going to play it from the perspective of white people. And so that's why I think that, yes, there are people intentionally fostering that division. And the best we could do, even though it's not a panacea, is to say we need to try to be as colorblind as possible.
Okay. A question from Arcade Outpost to Richard. Do you plan on running for office?
Well, I would love to, and I think it would be a wild show, but I don't think it kind of works in a way. There might have been some kind of window at some point. I mean, I think anytime if I were to run for office, it would be a quixotic campaign. I mean, it would be much like Ron Paul's runs. It would be intended to spread a message and not necessarily win, But I think it could be interesting. I just don't see it right now. I mean, a combination of things. I mean, the former alt-right generally hates me. I think there's a kind of nastiness post Charlottesville. There's a real nastiness to the media's depiction of me, whereas I think early on they were kind of there was a loving to hate me and maybe hating to love me kind of thing. You see a little bit of that, but I think it's very nasty. I just don't think it could happen. I just don't think that we've developed the kind of donor base for something like that to happen. So I just don't see it. And I don't know. I think also I've gotten older and I just have I have different concerns now. And I don't think I could run for office and be like, I can't solve your problems because your problems are actually spiritual. I mean, that'd be a kind of a weird thing to do. So I don't think it's happening, but it would be wild if it did.
Would you say you're a bit black-pilled?
No, I'm not black-pilled because I mean, I'm black-pilled on, say, Trump or populism or something like that. But I'm not depressed, or I don't think that there's no hope or something. I mean, I'm very energetic about something that I was working on for a number of hours today, which is Apolloism and Mark Brahman's
We have a
Rem
question about this coming up actually next. So
yeah, I mean that is something that I see that there's a road there. I think trying to reconstitute 2016 or 2017, if that's what I was trying to do, I would be blackpilled because I think that if that road doesn't lead anywhere,
Mm-hmm. Okay, so from Audible Duty said, second question for Richard, please elaborate on the whole Apollo thing. I heard you talk about it like 12 months ago and then never again. Can you at least give some references?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things I'm working on a book with Mark Brahman, my friend and collaborator. It is going to be massive. It has been the biggest editing project I've ever attempted. And a lot of that is because it is quite groundbreaking. So, how to describe Apolloism? Maybe you could simply say it's an attempt to reconstitute Roman spirituality in contradistinction to any kind of Abrahamic religion or atheism or something like that. That's one way of looking at it. Another way would be to say that it is an analysis of symbol and myth of all kinds, but particularly coming from the Hebrew Bible, and an analysis of a kind of international, long-term myth system that you can see in the Pentateuch and you can see in contemporary Hollywood. So it's a really remarkable, bold claim in that direction. I think in another way you could say it's a way of thinking about the world that resonates with me. And I think in terms of the ideological aspects to it, I'm sure that I've had a great deal of influence on Brahman in this case. It's a Nietzschean outlook. It is a pro-empire outlook. It is a pan-European outlook. It's a civilizational outlook. And it is it doesn't fall into what we see are traps of the kind of populist right or the Christian right. So if I were to sum it up, I hope I did it justice there. But it's a groundbreaking way of thinking. And it's another problem with Apolloism is you kind of pull on a thread and you look and you see how far that thread goes. And so that's why this book, I mean, Mark just delivered 20,000 new words, which I made him write. And it's like, oh my God, this might be multiple volumes. So we're going to get it right. And it's going to be a long-term project. But I think what's invigorating about REM or Apolloism is that it opens up a worldview. So from my perspective, white nationalism is just stuck in a rut. It's never going to actually go anywhere because it's all about complaining about anti-white bigotry, complaining about immigration, and kind of offering a kind of vague sense of identity, like we're white. Apolloism is kind of like opening up a new door into a way of thinking about the world where we're going to kind of set something in motion that could move for a few hundred years. That's what we are trying to do. And so again, this is not the only motivation, of course, but one of the motivations is just my total dissatisfaction, blackpilling, you could say, with white nationalism. It just doesn't interest me. And I've heard it all before. And I've heard the whining before. I've heard all their talking points. I know what they're going to say before they say it. It just bores me. And this offers a vision for something beyond where we are now. And that's very invigorating. So Mark Brahman, he's driven me crazy as his editor, but he really is, he has broken ground. And I'm very happy to be a part of that.
Okay. From K-Max McDonald, thank you for the super chat. He said, I asked Richard years back about Ronald Reagan and what was wrong with him as president. I think both guests would see Reagan as a cult of personality, but not effective as populism. How do Richard and Rob compare Reagan to Trump?
I can go first if you want. So
You can go first. Yeah.
one of the things that people overlook with Reagan's immigration policies are actually what led to a lot of the policies we see today. So there's this sort of whitewashing of history where, you know, people were like, Reagan was this, all of the things that conservatives value today, Reagan was for. Not really. He was for small government economically, but for big government sort of on a lot of social policies. And when it came to immigration, he was in favor of it. You know, how did he stack up against Trump? Well, I think that Reagan had more of an establishment appeal to him than Trump, right? Like, even though he was seen as an outsider at first, by the end of Reagan's presidency, he certainly was someone that, you know, your average, you know, run-of-the-mill Republican that had been in state office or something like that was full-on supporting. Trump seemed to get the ire of many of those people. So when it came to sort of the populism that what was embraced or what was thought of by the people that identify as populist, I think Trump was seen as representing more of that than Reagan. He was bringing people in that never had voted before, that weren't even interested in politics before. I don't know that Reagan did as much of that. Now, fairness, I'm only 37, so I was only 4 when Reagan left office. So I can't speak to what the atmosphere was like when Reagan ran for the first time, as far as the kind of enthusiasm that new voters had or something like that. Now, ultimately, though, speaking a little of Reagan's failure, like, as I'll say, I think that Trump failed to implement a lot of the policies. You could say it was his fault or it wasn't his fault. There were extenuating circumstances, but I think that he did fail with implementing a lot of that.
I think there are a lot of similarities between Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan. And actually, that includes their bad immigration policies. Reagan did it was 1986 amnesty and so on. Immigration was not even close to being the type of issue that it is now and has been for about 15 years or so, but it was something. But Trump himself in 2018, when the economy was buzzing, the stock market was at all-time high, was basically saying things like, we're going to need more immigrants and so on. So I don't think they're that dissimilar in that way. And I think both of them were kind of populist, and I know Rob's going to disagree with me, but race baiting in the sense, where was it that Reagan launched his initial campaign? He actually launched it in some place where there was like a major Klan rally. I'll have to go look up the detail. But Reagan relied on the Southern strategy that, again, preceded him much more than is remembered now by current conservatives. And all of the stuff that Rob was talking about, you know, like Reagan Democrats or non-voters, that's exactly what Trump was appealing to. Both of them were hotly polarizing figures. Maybe not quite as polarizing. Reagan wasn't quite as polarizing as George W. Bush in his second term, but he was definitely polarizing. So I think there are actually a lot of similarities. And Reagan, you know, he almost coined the term "Make America Great Again." I mean, he said that in a speech. So I think there's actually a lot of similarities between the two. Both of them as well are being kind of deified by the mainstream GOP, despite the fact that the mainstream GOP was absolutely hostile towards them in the beginning. So the mainstream GOP went against Reagan in the 1976 Republican convention, and they went with Ford. People like Dick Cheney and so on were all ganging up on Reagan. Reagan ultimately triumphed. Similar situation in 2016. But then Reagan became this god at CPAC in the way that Trump is now. I mean, Trump at TPUSA or CPAC, all those places, Trump is a deity, basically. So I think there are actually a lot of similarities between them.
All right. So from K Max McDonald, again, thank you for the super chat. He said, "Does Rob see what caused the Richard Spencer wing to grow and leave the GOP was betrayal on immigration? If GOP wants cheap labor, they will always betray us on the border. How does a free market person protect the U.S. worker from cheaper labor?"
Well, again, I don't disagree. And I think that's something that Richard said. He's conflating sort of populism with Republicans, right? With the average stereotypical. The reality is with immigration, neither the Democratic Party or the Republican Party want it solved. The Democratic Party doesn't want it solved because they seek to have sort of cultural imports, and they want a voting base that's reliable, and it will change sort of, again, I don't care racially, but it'll change sort of, you know, people's perception of the government and reliance on the government. And it also has the net effect, the people that are harmed the most by illegal immigration are actually people that are low education, particularly people who don't have a high school degree that live in cities, because they're actually directly competing with many of these illegal immigrants that come into work. So that's certainly the Republican Party. They've been for illegal immigration because it's cheap labor for a lot of their business, friends, that lobbyists, etc. Trump spoke. Keep in mind, the mainstream, Trump did have this enthusiasm that Richard talked about. He had this charisma. There was something about him, right? There was a lot of stuff. But there were all these people, a lot of Trump's failures, I think, come from listening to the people around him. And most of those people, if they weren't outright sabotaging him, were telling him things like, no, you need to get back more in line with the mainstream Republican message. So stop talking about immigration as much. Stop talking about the wall. You're doing good with the tax cuts. That's good, right? Keep that sort of message going. And so I think that, yes, that the mainstream Republican Party, either through cowardice or because at the top level they actually didn't want to solve the problem of illegal immigration, they allowed it to continue. I think that there is a populist movement to deal with illegal immigration and to deal with border security. Personally, I'm not saying that it's even feasible to deport up to 30 million illegal immigrants. That's not what I'm saying. But before we can talk about what to do with the people that are already here, we have to secure the border, and it's getting worse. Like Richard said, it was worse 20 years ago. Maybe, but it's as bad as it was 20 years ago, and that's a step in the wrong direction. So yeah, I agree. I just think that with the questioner and with Richard, I don't know the questioner necessarily, but my disagreement is you don't just look at the failure from Republicans and failure of Trump and saying, oh, it's a grift. No one really believes that. Well, then fine. We'll push for people that are more serious about that situation.
Okay. All right, so from K. Max McDonald, again, thank you for the super chat. He said, what are both guests' opinion on George Bush and his presidency? I feel he was among the worst we ever had. Thus, he helped created the alt-right. If Al Gore had been president, would the alt-right have been created? And what about wokeness?
Yeah, I think George W. Bush was one of the worst. I could say that I disagree with almost everything that he did. Although he did enact the no call list, didn't he? Like the federal no, so that was actually good. But it's an interesting. It depends on what you're talking about with the alt-right. If you're just talking about me, there's no question that my own personal trajectory went through or went against George W. Bush. It went through the anti-war movement and went through Ron Paul libertarianism and went through all that. And then it kind of ended up at the alt-right. That's definitely true. But would Trump, absent George W. Bush, I'm not sure I agree with that, because the alt-right also was a kind of, a different version of the alt-right, not me, but a different version of it, which is the kind of online engagement, crazy 4chan culture. That probably was its own thing that kind of would have appeared, and is one of many symptoms of a kind of wider angst and wider problems due to society and technology.
I don't think that there was a marked difference between the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration, to be quite honest with you, at least not in the issues that I cared about. So I was just entering college in 2002, 2003. And, I was heavily against the Iraq war once I figured out what was going on. Barack Obama, I saw through it, but he was sold as this man of peace. He was going to stop these foreign wars, which was the big issue that I was concerned with at the time. He was not that. He continued those policies and he invaded more countries. I don't know that Al Gore would have not went into Iraq. So if like Richard said, I can't speak to, and I'm sure Richard can't speak to himself, if going back, what exactly would have happened if we had a different president, if he would have still been a central figure in the alt-right movement. But I will say there's certainly, I don't think that even though I despise Bush, I don't think that having Al Gore there would have prevented the sort of issues that people in the alt-right wanted to talk about from talking about them. And so, and I think it's evidenced by the fact that Obama basically carried on many of the same policies that they were furious about. In fact, was probably worse. In fact, the alt-right could have been sooner and stronger had Gore been there instead of Bush, because maybe it would have been the same wars and things like that, but it would have been more pushing sort of woke stuff and things like that would have got the ire of the alt-right.
From T.S. Zymic. Okay, 77. He said, question to Richard, when can we expect the publishing of the Apollonian transmission?
Yeah, okay.
What do you call it?
Oh yeah, Apolloism. It's called Rem. It will be called Rem Volume 1, The Birth of Tragedy is the title of the book. We have a cover basically, but maybe I should get something out. Yes, again, it keeps growing, and I've gone through a lot of I mean, when I first got the manuscript, it was a few years ago, and it's like a 200,000 word document that wasn't fully refined and wasn't well organized. So I mean, it's just, and I think Mark understandably was kind of like, well, let's just get it out there, let's publish it. But he's come to heal to understand that we really need to nail it, because if we get things, we'll certainly get some things wrong, but if we get big things wrong, and it doesn't seem, buttoned up and really professional, then we're going to get just horrible criticism and critique that's justified. So we've got to get it right. But the other thing about it is that it's such a new sphere that we're kind of refining things now. And so it's very different when I work with, like, when I published a lot of books by Ed Dutton, who he knows what he's doing. He goes and researches, he focuses on something, and it's like, boom. And I do edit it a lot, but it's kind of more style and tweaks and things like that. With Rem, it's like we're trying to create a way of thinking that is genuinely new. And that is just very hard. Long story short, out by the end of the year.
Okay. From Benno Silent, he said, question, why does Rob support white genocide? Basic math shows that everywhere whites and non-whites are forced to live together, that there will eventually be no more whites because non-whites kill whites at 8 times the rate we killed them.
Well, first off, I think Richard would be in the same boat as me, right? So I don't know why the question's directed at just me, because Richard himself says that it's inevitable, in the sense that we're not going to have succession. That stuff's not going to happen. And so it is what it is. So it's not supporting white genocide. It's nonsense. You could take statistics and things like that, whether it be birth rates, whether it be homicide rates and things like that. And you could say that somehow makes some moral proclamation, or it somehow makes some proclamation that if you would have these rates that would continue out through end of time, that mathematically could lead to an extinction of a certain race. I think that's nonsense, right? Even if there are significant problems that we can see with different populations, with different characteristics or different data sets that come up, I think talking about data sets is perfectly fine. But implying sort of the moral failures of someone, or saying that it has to do with sort of genetic failures of people, I think is a mistake. I think that me saying that I want to continue to try to be as colorblind as possible is the best possible solution for all peoples. And at the end of the day, I'm less concerned about racial makeup, even though I understand there are people concerned about racial makeup, than I am about ideological makeup. I want people that share the same values as me. I don't care if they share the same race as me as much. And so the idea that somehow approaching through that and trying to have a more colorblind society, acknowledging the reality that we live in a society with different races and that that's never going to change, doesn't make me any more a supporter of white genocide than it makes you a supporter of black genocide if you somehow say that it's worth talking about these issues.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are more white people around the globe now than there ever have been in history. I also don't quite buy the extinction argument that because of crime rates that we're going to go extinct. And in many ways, everyone on the planet is suffering this demographic decline due to a number of different factors. Although sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa, is still growing in population. So things are going to change. I mean, the demographic change of the American population is just simply baked into the cake. And so are you going to try to almost like retroactively change it? That's almost like what I think immigration reformists want to believe. It's like we can stop immigration. There can be an immigration moratorium, and then like all the immigrants will vanish into thin air, like Avengers Endgame or something. It's not going to work. Even if you were to have a full immigration moratorium, the demographic change would still occur due to populations that are currently in effect and to differential birth rates. So it's just a weird losing issue. It's like trying to go back in time and solve something. It just does not make sense. Again, that's the one thing that white nationalists will all agree upon. They'll all get excited about, and it's the one thing that can't really change. And it's just very frustrating. There is a ceiling on that movement. Wokeness is not created by the Hispanicization of America. That actually has nothing to do with it. And if anything, Hispanics are a retarding factor to the growth of wokeness. So they rage against all these things, and then they're like, well, we just need an immigration moratorium. It's frustrated me for a long time, and at this point I'm like, not interested in talking with these people. I think the big question is, like, if we accept the reality of demographic decline and we face that, what are we going to do about it? How can that problem be solved? How can we build a civilization in the future? That's the questions we should ask, as opposed to how can we save America? You're not going to save America.
Yeah, and
Virginia.
And Richard will be back on Tuesday to talk to Sean Last about immigration. I don't know if it'll be technically a debate, but they're going to have a chat, so that'll be fun. Okay, so from Astro Nerfused, he said this bug dude is a literal F slur. Just gonna go with that. There was nothing stopping the Trump side of things, and he's dodging the question. Who effing believes this shit still? Okay, I'm not gonna read that line.
Well, I can answer it. I assume they're talking to me. Yeah. Of course, there were right. The colorful language, though. By the way, say what you will about people's politics and stuff like that. Do you really think that it makes you sound more persuasive or worthwhile listening if you want a legitimate answer from someone you're listening to talk like that? I don't. But anyways, of course, there were all sorts of things that were stopping Trump from doing what he was doing. But at the end of the day, if you watch me routinely, I say that stuff's all irrelevant, right? You can say whatever. We do this all the time through life, right? You might be Tom Brady and you have the worst team in the league and you make the playoffs and you get blown out in the game. And you could blame all of the other factors, but at the end of the day, Tom Brady lost. And that's the truth about Trump. Blame should be placed on him. And there were a lot of self-enforced errors, such as intentionally. I mean, you claim to be someone who's questioning these wars and stuff, and you appoint John Bolton? And that's who you appoint? I mean, come on, this was obvious stuff. And there were tons of things that he could have done that were self-enforced errors. But he also was facing something, not just the sort of bureaucracy behind him that was like basically attacking him in every possible way. I mean, literally, there was a coup that went on against Trump from our intel agencies that was constantly spying on his administration, that was constantly leaking to the press, that was going after, his, Michael Flynn, who he had picked, that was going to be his Secretary of Defense. Like, they went after his son, Flynn's son, made him plead guilty to stuff that he didn't do. Like, this stuff was heinous. In addition to that, though, you also had the entire mainstream culture pushing back on this guy as a racist, as a bigot, as a horrible person, trying to go through everything that he had ever done with a fine-tooth comb to find anything that they could smear him, smear his family, smear his wife, smear his kids. It was staggering, the amount of power that he was going up against, and I think that he underestimated. So both things could be true simultaneously, that he fought against, or he was up against near insurmountable odds, but at the same time that he had a lot of errors and a lot of things that he did that were boneheaded that he deserves criticism for.
Okay. And then Astro Nerfuse, he said colorblind equals no white people.
It's not true. And I still don't get this from, like, maybe if Richard had 3 hours to explain to me kind of the book he's working on, it would kind of explain what his values are or what his strategy is going forward. But if we are all in agreement that inevitably, that regardless of how you gnash your teeth or scream, there isn't going to be an ethno-state. It's not happening. It's not happening, period. It's not happening. So how do we go forward? What's the best way going forward? And the best way going forward is to be as colorblind as possible. And I understand there are people that make the argument that we should be colorblind, but in secret, or what they're actually dog whistling to is that they want policies that are antithetical to white people because they view white people as, sins of the past and they're somehow the oppressors and things like that. I get that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when I say colorblind, I truly mean it. That we admit that every country has sins of their past. Every ethnicity, every family lineage has sins of the past. The best we could do forward is saying, okay, if it didn't happen in your lifetime, we have to move forward. And we govern that way, and we have culture that way that maximizes the similarities and stops focusing on picking the scab of maximizing differences.
You also said, literally, who gives a fuck what you think? You're effing stupid and condemning us. F off, F slur. Sorry.
Okay.
Very salient point. You want to come on and debate next week? You sound like a real genius.
Okay, so from Swank, question for Richard. What are your thoughts on Andrei Tarkovsky and his work? And have you read his book, Sculpting in Time? It essentially goes through his approach to filmmaking and brings into question certain claims made by REM theory, especially on symbolism in film.
Ah, interesting. Okay, I've not read that book. I'm well aware of Tarkovsky. I would recommend that anyone watch Solaris, not the George Clooney Hollywood kind of remake, but the original version from the early 70s. It was kind of the Soviet Union's answer to 2001. And it is an amazing film. It really affected me when I watched it first on VHS 20 years ago. It's a tremendous film. And Stalker as well is justly famous. He's one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, maybe the greatest Soviet filmmaker. And that's very interesting about him bringing into question aspects of REM theory. I'll have to go check out that book. Again, the fact that he doesn't pursue racial esoteric moralization does not mean that it is not a symbolic language, particularly in Hollywood. But interesting. I'll have to go check it out.
Okay. From Benno Silent, he said, what do you mean there won't be an ethno-state? How big do you think it has to be? It could literally just be a few states. It doesn't have to be the entire country. You both sidestep the question of basic math. No white nationalist thinks they're going to save America with immigration moratorium.
Well,
I don't know what. Go ahead.
Do they? I mean, that's what I hear. That's all I mean, what does the white nationalist movement, or what does like Peter Brimelow or Jared Taylor, like what are they trying to do then? No one thinks that. I think they all think that, actually. But also like a white ethno state, like a Alabama or something. I don't know what you're talking about. That the government of the United States is not going to allow you to just create your own little government, like in a velvet divorce where you both agree. And that's just not going to happen. There was a reason why there was a so-called civil war, which was a war of secession, as Southerners say. I mean, it was a crackdown by the national government on a seceding group. And they just will not let that happen. Now, could that happen if the United States government starts to really collapse, like truly lose, hyperinflation and collapse scenario? Of course, a lot of things are possible in that scenario. But it's just what white nationalists are trying to accomplish cannot be accomplished. And it's very frustrating. The movement is just in this rut, and it doesn't want to get out of the rut, because getting out of the rut would mean that they would have to examine presumptions that they have, and they don't want to do that. They just want to keep on their little grift. So I have no interest in them.
And also, like, Richard's right to bring up the Civil War, and we saw how that war was fought and what happened there. And understand, there you had huge percentages of people that wanted to secede, right? Huge percentage. I don't know exactly what the population difference, but I'm guessing at least 30% of the country was in the South. Probably slightly higher than that. I don't know. There are not that many people that want a white nationalist enclave. They're just not. So where are you going to have the power to enforce this? The government's not going to willingly give you this land. And there's not a lot of people that support your movement that will be for it. So what are you going to do? Even if you found 1 million people, do you think that that's going to be enough to say, oh, we have 1 million people, we're going to, it's not going to happen. And the other thing is it would be logistically a nightmare, because who do you decide? Every white nationalist isn't the same. For example, are Jewish people white? Some white nationalists I talk to say yes. Some say no. So there's going to be infighting as to what exact people are allowed in each exact area, which is stupid anyways. And then what do? How do you forcibly remove someone who owns private property, which is actually, a value that I think is very important, owning your property, your land, and things like that? What do you say? Sorry, you got to go? You're out? This is just a nightmare. It is never going to happen. It is a pipe dream. And even if you really want it to happen, I think that you're immoral if you want it to happen. But I also think that strategically, it is nonsensical. You are just playing. You're not accomplishing anything, because it is completely impractical. It is a pipe dream, and it is nowhere near happening. Now, Richard's right. If we saw some dystopian future like, The Road or something like that, yeah, I guess we could have enclaves of people based on race or cannibalism or whatever. Theoretically, that could happen, but I think we'll have more problems then. So it's not even worth talking about.
So most of the white nationalists that I talk to, they don't seem to be talking about something by force, at least from not what I've seen. But even in general, it seemed like both sides, and this was like before I kind of got into this stuff, have been more supportive of some sort of secession, more along party lines, not so much racial lines, at least for the left wing. And I don't know if maybe that alone would kind of give them their ethno state if they did the party line type of secession, because a lot of lefties seem to be in favor of that as well. But
it does almost seem like an inevitability of radical polarization that we just divide up red states and blue states. Mm-hmm. What I would say to that are a couple of things. Again, the United States government has a planetary empire to run, and the degree to which it would be demoralized by engaging in this kind of velvet divorce would just, it would not accept that. I mean, that would threaten the U.S. military empire, it threaten the dollar system, et cetera. It's just, it would not allow that to happen. The other thing I would point out, the difference between, the 2020s and the 1860s is that the elites, there were real Southern planter elites that had very different interest than, say, the Eastern Seaboard elites. So you had, all of the people all the Southern commanders, with maybe a notable exception of Stonewall Jackson, were effectively billionaires. These people owned human property, they owned land, they had major crop income, and so on. And they were absolutely constituted a real elite. They were the billionaires of that time, and they were opposed to another set of billionaires. Today, I don't really see that. I don't see like a red state billionaire contingent. There might be some red state billionaires who want to like throw money at Republicans or whatever, but the idea that they would go all the way and try to create their own country, I just don't see it. The elite is more or less in line on the things that really matter. There aren't red state billionaires who want to end the empire, end the dollar system, or end the country. So we're in a very different position than we were in the 1860s, although there are some striking similarities, I would add. The obsession with the presidency, because so much of the Civil War was about the election of Abraham Lincoln. And you can see that now with something like January 6th being this sporadic kind of sort of insurrection. There are some interesting similarities, but the differences, I think, are more important.
And I'll just add real quick, it would have to have some kind of force behind it, because otherwise you would have to get far more people online with that movement to be able to vote into something like that. And it's just, we're nowhere near that. And the other thing is the difference between, even I think it's a pipe dream that will secede politically, or at least in the way people are talking. But even if that occurred, think of like, let's just say that the coasts all are one country and then the center is another country. Say it went that way. Like, what are you going to do? Do you think California is going to like kick in doors and be like, is there a Republican in here? You're out. This is just for no, it wouldn't happen that way. And that's that's how an ethno state would work. Like, because you're saying people that don't meet these characteristics aren't welcome here. So you would have to forcibly remove those people. And that's completely different than saying, some states want to secede from the union, because those states would never be saying, and we're going to kick people out based on racial makeup or based on political. They're just not going to say it.
What about if they did something kind of like the European Union type of thing, where each state became its own country, and maybe like the federal government was for military? Do you think something like that is possible?
Well, that's
no,
kind of like what we have.
Federalism, right.
That's kind of sort of like American federalism,
Mm-hmm.
Where the states are more or less sovereign. I mean, you pay taxes to the states, and they have different laws and so on. But I don't know. I think you would just be kind of reinventing that tug of war that the federal government will eventually win.
You could just vote, right? Put people in the federal government that are more interested in states' rights and less power for themselves. That's part of a populist movement, I think. More power centralized locally. But yeah, I mean, and even in that system, Brittany, like, what are you going to do? Like, the white nationalists, it's so crazy, because when you bring it up, they're like, every group, you're like, well, what about this group? Yeah, they get a country too. So now we're going to have 50 countries that are all within their borders allowed to say, and we're going to kick people out based on immutable characteristics. Like, just think of, like, I know probably no one cares about this. Think of how that looks on the world stage. Like, how would we feel if all of a sudden France came out and said, you know what, we're not going to have any more people of Asian descent in France. See ya. You're all out. What would the world stage view that as? They'd be like, what? Are you serious? And so, face it, the ethno-nationalists
place to go to.
So, but that's irrelevant, right? There is a place for white people to go.
Where?
No one's kicking white people
Brittany,
out of this country.
We don't need our little safe space like Jews think about Israel. Aryanism is about conquering other people's safe spaces. Like, I don't know, like, the essence of being Aryan is not like being safe. It's about being a horrifying badass that descends on a chariot and plunders the world. I mean, that's who we are, Brittany. We're the villains of history. We aren't the good guys. So
right.
I agree. Again, I agree with critical race theory. It's completely correct.
But my question is, so like, if we're the villains of history and we become the minority, and there is some kind of racial revenge,
we've always been the minority.
In the world, but not in this country.
Right.
But if there's some kind of racial revenge that happens, where do white people go for safe haven?
We better win.
You
just have to fight harder and be more ruthless and evil than the other people. I mean, I am sorry, but that really is the answer. But there's no nice solution. Like, Israel is look, I made these comparisons as well in my past between like an ethno state and Israel, etc. But like, there is no like Israel that's a unique thing, and it's not something that we're going to have like some little happy homeland that's just for us that we can seek refuge in. I mean, we're going to have, if we're going to have a safe space for us, it's going to have to be very large. It's going to have to be a large space, something like the European Union or something like that. It's going to have to be grand on that scale. But I'm sorry, maybe I had a little, I'm not drunk or anything. I just had a little touch of whiskey that brings out the old Spencerism, where I start talking about, Aryan conquerors and so on. But like, that is who we are. Like, we need to be concerned not about like keeping people out, but like, why aren't we going to other places? Like, why aren't we exploring the galaxy at this point? Why are we so like lame, shriveled versions of white people that we just sit around on the internet all day and so on? Like, we need to ask ourselves those questions, because that's who we are at the end of the day. And we aren't the kind of happy homeland nice guys that I think a lot of white nationalists want us to be, and we should just embrace it.
And I don't understand. Like, again, you're more than willing. I won't criticize anyone for wanting to embrace a group identity based on race or based on gender or anything else. That's fine. I don't care. But the idea of like, advocating for your particularly in preference group and worry that that groups outside of that will eventually attack you. Well, that's kind of built into the cake as well. For example, some of the most rabid people that are speaking on the most anti-white cultural stuff are, drumroll please, white people. Particularly white people like that you see in these like liberal circles. So what are we going to do? Like, are those white people welcome in this ethno state that we have as well? And they're still going to be rabidly anti-white. So the best we can do, I don't understand people's fear in that. I understand the idea of being attacked for immutable characteristics. I fight back against it every day. But the best we could do is, instead of saying, well, we'll play that game too, because Richard already told you, and I don't disagree with him, and it's inevitable, even if we stop immigration, if things proceed apace, that whites will be the minority in this country. So if your solution is, let's play that identity politics game hard right now, let's attack, let's do it. Well, inevitably, you're going to be the minority. And now you've set the precedent. When you were when you had the plurality, you attacked, and now the other groups are going to attack. Instead, we should. I'm not someone who's concerned about this, but if this is your concern, what you should be doing now, when you're not the minority, is saying, we're going to try to have an egalitarian society as much as possible that doesn't focus on race. That's the best hope you have.
Right. But like, isn't that kind of the point, the fact that you just mentioned that, okay, there's all these white people that are also being anti-white. So it seems like, the propaganda is so extreme that the fact that white people can be anti-white, where do white people go if anything does happen? Like, what happens?
Let me put it this way. Anytime we're talking, like when I talk about populism, like if I'm talking about the elites versus populists, the reality is, and this is the same if you're talking Republican versus Democrat or right versus left, all of these groups, the reality is most people fall somewhere in between. Very few people are extreme right or extreme left or extreme populist or extreme, and for the hegemon or the deep state jerks that Richard keeps defending here. But very few people are fully on that. So the way your side wins is to get more and more people in the center, or that are only slightly one way or the other. What do the white nationalists think will happen right now? Because there are millions of people in the center that are like, yeah, we don't like this woke anti-white stuff. We don't like a lot of them. They don't like, for example, where a lot of these trans issues are going. Most people think this is what most people think of the trans issue. Absolutely, we shouldn't be prejudiced to people because they're trans. If you're an adult and you want to be trans, no problem, more power to you. We'll treat you as a human being. But this whole athletic stuff, the kind of indoctrinating kids to it, puberty blockers for children, we kind of have a question about that. That's where most people fall. And so, with these issues, the way you want to get those people kind of on your side, if you're like, oh yeah, and ethno-state. Also, we want an ethno-state. Literally, all of those people in the center that are already super ideologically aligned with you are like, done. I'm not listening to this.
But to defend those people, I mean, normies just fundamentally don't make history. Major radical change has. I mean, this is another problem with populism that I guess I could have brought up. I mean, at the end of the day, what your neighbor thinks doesn't fundamentally matter. I mean, your neighbor, quote unquote, the normie, would have opposed everything from the Copernican global system to, Protestantism, at least at the beginning, to, the American Republic, to so on. I mean, these things are always minority views, and they're always viewed with skepticism and sometimes horror by normies. So, I mean, if what you want to do is just build a coalition by being nice, fine, good on you. But I guess what I'm saying, and I think Brittany's saying this as well, I mean, there is a limit to that. I do want fundamental radical change in the world. I want a new world. And I am okay with the fact that 99% of the people are going to disagree with me. I'm fine with that. And I'm nice to them. I'm cruel and ruthless ideologically. Personally speaking, I'm nice to woke people, but it's just you have to accept that fact that if you really want to change society, you are going to be in a tiny minority. And most people aren't kind of psychologically prepared for that because it is very painful.
But listen, it's not just a matter of being nice to people, right? So we're looking at what we're talking about here. One, we're admitting that it's just not going to happen, that it's practically impossible, right? You're just not going to have an ethno-state out of the United States. It's not going to happen. And yet the people that still want to push that, well, what do they get out of it then? If the end goal is, and again, this isn't my end goal, But if you're out there and you're concerned about this and you say, I'm afraid for my white grandchildren, right? If that's what I think that there's going to be retribution against my white grandchildren. So if that's so the goal then that we're talking about is how do we best protect the white grandchild in this scenario, right? That's what we're talking about.
How do we do it, Rob?
Okay, so if the ethno-state thing's not going to happen, then what benefit do we get from keep pushing it? What's the benefit?
What if you're not pushing that, though? What if you're just trying to slow down becoming a minority in your country and maybe have it going that route? I mean, what if people are not trying to like?
I don't want to slow anything down. I want to speed things up. Like we let's reach the end of this paradigm that we've been living under. Why delay it? I mean, that's again another criticism I would have of like the immigration reform people. It's like you want a moratorium, you want to delay 2050 by 10 years, maybe 15. What's the point? You're actually not saving your grandchild in that scenario. And so like let's bring it on. You know, right, I mean, it's like we've got there. We need to bring it on in a point where we are ideologically, psychologically, and financially able to change things. Because sometimes when things get worse, they just keep getting worse. You know, and like a collapse might open up a lot of opportunities, but as Rob was saying, it might also open up, you know, cannibalism and just horrible, much worse for your grandchildren than Joe Biden. So, you know, it's like, I don't know, we have to be kind of moving to that point, but I think it's a weak argument from a white nationalist perspective, just to say kind of like, well, I want to delay demographic change. It's just not going to happen. And in a way, also the ideological change, like wokeness, is much more intense and isn't dependent upon demographic change, as we've all actually agreed upon.
Yeah, and to further say what I was saying, right? Like, if it's not going to happen, so you could say slow it down or whatever. That's a different argument than the ethno-state. But to keep pushing something that can't happen and that's seen as so morally repugnant. So it's not a matter of just getting the normies. First off, you're going to lose people that aren't normies like me. Plenty of people that are, I'm not a normie, but I'm also not like super talented or super popular. I'm not saying that like, oh, you need me, but I'm saying that there are a lot of people that are like, you know what? I heavily criticize the government and I'm, you know, willing to speak out and I'm willing to do stuff and I'm willing to run for office and all this stuff. You're going to lose all those, but you're going to lose everyone except the people in that group. And it's hard to have a movement that's not going to rely on force, that by the very nature of the movement isolates every single potential ally out there.
Why
so if it's not going to happen,
to push for their own self-interest, and white people are not allowed to, you get run off the internet, you get run off of like your job, you get run out of everything if you push to just protect yourself.
But again, like here's the problem. I don't have this is where when the left argues against white nationalism, this is where they go wrong. They act like that there's not a large cultural movement that treats white people as oppressors and denigrates them culturally and even politically. It's true. It happens. You could get someone on here, I'm sure, that could read hundreds of quotes of people in positions of power in our culture or politics and policies and things like that that are meant to denigrate or punish white people, or that even if they're not meant to, are at the expense of white people because they're racially focused and, like, you know, for example, the money giving out to farmers that the Biden administration did, right? That stuff exists. I'm arguing against that stuff. I'm saying that, look, it's sensible that any group that gathers together will want to have policies and to protect themselves and to protect their in-group. I don't think that makes you immoral. I think that you're right to say that there are attacks that go against, for example, Christians, and there are attacks against white people, and there are attacks against men, and there are attacks against straight people. All of this stuff's true. I agree with all this. But what I'm saying is the way to go forward isn't to say, fine, we'll play that game too. We're going to be racial identitarians. Like the way to play that game is to say, stop attacking us. And we're going to point out these attacks. And more people are waking up to like, yes, this is ridiculous. This race stuff that's being forced on our children is ridiculous. A lot of this woke stuff is ridiculous. I'm not saying, look, I'm not someone who's sitting here to tell you that like, I'm biblically saying like, we will win in the end. I ain't saying that. We might not win, but it's the best chance going forward that I can see. And it's also the most moral chance. If we just start saying, well, hey, they're attacking us, so we're going to advocate for white nationalism, you will lose. Just like I told the people that January 6th after it, when I had a small amount but of conservatives that were like, finally, January 6th, sometimes you need to refresh the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants. I was like, how'd that work out for you? Work out pretty well for you, right? It's even immoral to use political violence, but it was also unstrategic, particularly if you're on the side that doesn't have the cultural power right now. So anytime some right-winger wants to go out there and engage in violence, you are going to have the full force of the government and the culture put its boot on your neck. But the left will be allowed to get away with it predominantly because they've won sort of the cultural battle right now. And so this idea, advocating white nationalism and stuff, none of it's going to work. So even if you don't buy my argument that it's immoral, it's not going to work, and it's actually going to make things worse.
Like,
I'll tell you, Brittany, that biblically speaking, we will win.
Oh,
But you're not saying that Christianity, you're saying through Apolloism, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Christianity is, that will ensure losses. You're worshiping death and suffering. Yeah.
If you're Christian, you win in the end. You might not win in this world. I'll say that.
Well, you go win in the other world? Okay. Good luck with that.
Well, you're
enjoy yourself. I'd like to win in this world.
Do you think that, like,
I'm fighting?
let me do you think a few other questions, but then we also have some other super chats. But do you think that the multiracial, multicultural experiment has worked out for us?
Me or Rob?
For Rob.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like, so we would have to say, like, go back to the United States, not have slavery, not have anyone that's not of whatever we want to call white today. So Irish, Italian, Spanish, whatever. If we could go back in history and just have that and then run the United States experiment for 200 years, would we be better off today? Would the country be better off? I don't know. I think that forcing multiculturalism is a failure. I think that you definitely need to have a national identity. There needs to be something that brings people together. And I think what makes the United States unique and the greatest country in the history of the world was that it, through its foundational documents, understood the importance of the individual and the concepts of personal liberty and personal responsibility. I don't give a shit what skin color you are, or what country you come from. If you're here legally and those are the values you embrace, that's great. There needs to, and I think what happened is, if we don't coalesce around, like, England for the English or Spain for the Spanish, if you're not going to do that, which is fine, you don't have to do that. You have to have something cohesive. And what we see from the left and from the Democratic Party especially is sort of attack on those fundamental principles of our country and denigrating our country. And so if you don't have the same background and you don't have the same values, then what brings you together as a country? So there are ways to achieve. What's done is done, and it's not going to change. We're not going to become unicultural or uniracial. It's not going to happen. So the best we could do going forward is maximize those similarities, embrace those values of individuality and sort of a civic nationalism, and go forward from there.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to the super chats. From I of Odin, thank you for the super chat. He said, "Please bring on David Duke next time to debate." All right, and then so from Astro Fused said, "Who deadlifts the higher weight? How much does Richard deadlift? How much does Bugman deadlift?"
That's a good question.
I'll open up my Strong app here. So I did yesterday. I did 5x5 at 300 pounds.
When I was in high
school,
school,
you guys?
When I was in high school, I could deadlift around 300 pounds. I have not deadlift. I don't know.
I do it 25 times, not once.
I don't know if you can tell by my rotund figure, but I ain't doing a lot of deadlifting.
I genetically speaking, I've been a lot strong. My upper body is relatively. I mean, I can obviously deadlift a lot more. I don't know what my max in deadlift is. I'm sure it's over 400 pounds, but I could do a lot. I can ultimately deadlift, but I do feel like my upper body is kind of relatively stronger. I've never been like one of these guys who like goes to the squat rack and is, just, throwing the weight up. I don't, for whatever reason, I've just been a lot better at the upper body. It's just and I've kind of plateaued as I get older in terms of getting stronger with lower body stuff. But yeah.
From Thomas Sowell, who's not the real Thomas Sowell, but said, "Richard, should white nationalists and groypers just get it over with and convert to Islam?" By the way.
Well, it's funny because Ed Dutton, we have a short book that you can read. It's called Islam: An Evolutionary Perspective, and Edward Dutton doesn't quite suggest that, but it seems to be almost implied. It's a little bit of a twinkle, being a little cheeky, a twinkle in his eye. But there are certainly kind of benefits to Islam. But I think I would ultimately reject that. And you can see that in my advocacy for Apolloism. I don't think just embracing a kind of more harsh and backward version of an Abrahamic religion is a solution to the problem.
Okay. From Swank said, do you see similarities between the ideas and complaining, constant seething by dissident right reactionaries such as Nick Fuentes and Groypers when observing the Chad metrosexual Dems winning in the government and the slave morality as defined by Niche in the genealogy of morals?
I think this is a bit of a joke question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there is something kind of ironic to all of this because, it's like, first off, the Democratic Party is getting whiter, and it got whiter under Joe Biden than it was under Hillary Clinton or under Barack Obama. Interesting fact. And also, even though there does seem to be a kind of implication, I think Ed falls into this trap often, actually. But I like Ed too. We criticize everyone, but he'll fall into this trap where he'll kind of like assume that all liberals are like mentally insane and it's all non-whites and everyone's on meds or whatever. Keep in mind that there are a lot of highly successful suburban white liberals right now who are running major corporations and government. And they are actually winning, and they are above replacement fertility as well. There's also, and I think in some ways the kind of like Chad meme or like BAP meme or whatever, it does, not to be too mean here, but it does seem to be a kind of like fantasy of kids who understandably feel like alienated from the world and don't see a future for themselves. So I think there's a lot of ironies going on, but I think that question probably did understand something that's kind of was underneath a lot of the comments that I was saying, which is that Democrats, you can make fun of them all you want as pajama boys or as wokesters or whatever. At the end of the day, they are the hegemonic party. They are the natural party of government, and they are going to win in the foreseeable future. Like Jen Psaki, that type of person, like graduate school girl, like she's ultimately a lot closer to real power than you are. Mm-hmm. And I kind of can't stand her too, but you need to recognize that and not see all these people as like wimps and you're some strong guy. They're the ones in power. They're the ones setting the agenda. They're the ones informing culture, and you aren't. So you better think about that before you do stuff.
I don't disagree. They're also incompetent or corrupt. They're not very good. Look at the Afghanistan situation, right? Like we tend to think like, what if we're talking about people like I always took this quote from Christopher Hitchens. He said, treat all humans as animals, right? Like, or the way I put it is no one's really better than you and you're not better than anyone else, right? And we tend to look at people and we assume that because of their position that they must have some intelligence or some competency, and that's not always the case. So now the old people are back to running the show after 4 years of Trump, and how's it looking? Finally, the adults are back in the room. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but
it's not looking so good, is it?
I agree with a lot of that, but I sometimes see this with like Tucker Carlson. Well, he'll engage in this hysterical laughter about how incompetent and insane the Democrats are. And he read a tweet I saw this on Twitter last night. He read some kind of like right-wing Twitter character's tweet, and he was like, first they decided to go into Afghanistan and the graveyard of empires, and guess what? Now they decide to invade Russia in winter. And Tucker was like, in that hysterical laughter. And I get it, but like to assume that all of these people are dumb is wrong. At the end of the day, they have climbed the ladder, and they might be kind of, from one perspective, kind of mediocrities on some level, but they have climbed the ladder. They are in power. They have every incentive to survive. I mean, to object to someone invading Russia in winter, do you think Napoleon was an idiot? Do you think Hitler was an idiot? I mean, he might have been many things, but I don't think he was just an idiot. And Barbarossa began in June also, by the way. But anyway, these people know how to survive. They know how to stay in power. They know how to climb the ladder. They're not all stupid. And
Well,
you aren't just smarter than them.
No, that's exactly right.
Tucker.
You're actually right. And here's the deal. Knowing how to stay in power is different than knowing how to govern for the people. And you're absolutely right. That is the talent that so many of these people in the Democratic Party have. It's the same talent that you see people in academia have. They might not know how to teach, but they know how to make sure they get tenure. They know how to make sure that
they know how to make sure they get tenure. They know how to get grants. They know how to go to the
That's
flow.
right. And what I tell people all the time is I would like to see more people get involved. If you could run for office, run for office. And what I tell people is, if you're intimidated, if you look and you say, listen, I just don't think I could do it. I don't think that I could be on the local school board, or I don't think that I could run for state office or even national office because it just seems so daunting. You're probably not less qualified to govern. You know where your deficiencies lie? You don't know how to get elected. That's where they're experts. They know how to keep power. They know how to get power, and they know how to keep it. But it's a mistake to think like, oh, well, if you're a general, you must know how to prosecute a war. And then we see what happened with General Miley as he's talking about white rage, and he loses to a bunch of people in Afghanistan that, that the Afghan forces outnumbered 2-1 and had superior technology, etc. And he lost in like 3 days. That's how bad the situation was there with what they did. So, that's what I feel but that doesn't mean you're stupid in the same way, right? There are different areas of knowledge and different areas of expertise. And you're absolutely right that you shouldn't just look at someone like Jen Psaki and say she's dumb. She's not dumb. She's not, but they don't have the competency to govern that you would assume they would being career politicians.
I kind of have a crush on Jen Psaki.
All right. So from government issue, he said,
she reminds me of graduate school girls. So that's why I said that.
He said, I don't want to kick anyone out as much as I don't want to be forced to allow people in. In theory, my private business should be able to choose its clients based on whatever criteria I like. If I'm not advertising myself as serving the public, if I'm forced to provide services, why not hospitality? I don't know what they're talking about.
It's an interesting argument. People so I've heard this argument made before. I forget where I read this, but someone was like, you should be allowed to refuse service based on race if you want, but you have to advertise it. So you have to put it up prominently in your window. We don't serve blacks here. And then what will happen is basically the market will take care of your business because enough people will be like, okay, we're not going to frequent that place then. And then you won't be able to go in business. Ultimately, there are fundamental questions that we have. Like, for example, there's the infamous example of the baker that was forced to bake the cake for, the gay wedding. And he claimed that was against his religious values. So you could take to the logical extension. If you think that guy should be allowed to refrain from baking that cake, then should he be allowed to refrain from baking a cake for a black marriage? I don't think so. I think that I'm not a total anarchist. I do think that there's a role for government regulation. And I think telling businesses that they can't refuse service for immutable characteristics like race or sex is something that's worthwhile. It's different when it comes to forcing them to perform services for institutions that they may not agree with.
Every aspect of wokeness is built upon when policy occurs. Every aspect of wokeness is built upon the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So they just extended the logic to women's sports, even famous Title IX, the 70s. And now it's, there's going to be some kind of anti-transsexual discrimination logic that's going to.
Isn't it hilarious? Title IX is going to be what takes women's sports out.
Yeah. There are a lot of weird, absolutely. The transsexuals in sports is a weird contradiction where you kind of can't get your mind around it. But yeah.
And they followed up saying, I will say my previous comment should be taken in the context of inhabiting American society as it currently is. I don't mind my business being forced to serve the public if the public meets a certain standard. I think we can all recognize a certain level of parasitism has affected American society.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's
Also,
that's
let me do this. I'm going to take one more. I'm getting very hungry. So
Yeah, we're about done.
that's
We have one last thing from Dan Zamity said, if we had a right wing state, the lefties would be jealous and end up wanting to come over. So we can do final thoughts now if you want. So Spencer, if you want to go first, you can.
all right, I'll just quote Enoch Powell. He famous intellectual in politics. The Conservative Party wanted to benefit from the problems, but could offer no solution to the problems. I think that is the fundamental issue that I have with the American right and the fundamental issue I have with populism.
Okay. Rob?
I think that conflating populism with sort of the establishment Republicans or just Trump is a mistake. I think that we do have a governance system that doesn't care about average people on the left or the right, and that's why populism is naturally increasing, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I think it's the best chance we have to actually having systems of government that care about average people, regardless of their political beliefs. I think that Trump did a lot of good, although there were some things that he did that he certainly could have done better and some that were outright bad. But at the end of the day, I think it's the best way going forward. And I just want to say that, like, it's incredible to me that Richard's embracing the party of the woke and embracing the Democratic Party, because saying one side didn't do enough. So now I'm going to totally go for the other side that does all of these horrible things, that's responsible for a lot of things we're criticizing. And even though maybe not a white nationalist now, I think that this is logically where many white nationalists will end up in the Democratic Party because the identity politics is so strong there.
Well, I'm a bit of a wokester myself.
No well, yeah, thank you guys both for coming on. Again, Richard will be back on Tuesday to talk to Sean Last. We will be back tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern with Wurzel Root and Tom Foolery. They'll be talking about pedophilia versus racism. So that should be fun.
What?
Yeah.
Is anyone taking the stance they're both bad? I can come on and say that, right?
I guess we'll find out. We had a panel on
That-
it, and Tom wants to do a one-on-one debate. So, yeah, that'll be fun. You can go eat now.
He's
Richard.
a bold stance opposing
Yeah.
pedophilia. Yeah, that's
exactly
contrarian view, I guess.
Yeah, and I have their links in the description, you guys, and our link tree. You can find all our links. I don't know what's gonna happen with our YouTube, but probably not gonna get it back. But yeah, so we will be back tomorrow night. Thanks again, guys, for coming on, and we are out.
Thanks to all of you.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Rob.
Yeah.